Greetings, brave warriors and shield maidens. If you seek the strength and wisdom of the ancient Vikings, you've come to the right place. Don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now and join our horde to strengthen this community of true Vikings. As you can see, our channel is new, so your subscription is crucial to our growth. If you're a true fan of the Vikings, show your support. Let the power of the Viking axe guide your hand to click the like button, and in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from so we know where in the world our stories are reaching, all because the Longhouse bustled with activity as Harold, the fearless Viking warrior, sat at the head of the great table. His fingers drummed against the worn wood, his mind far away from the chatter and laughter that filled the air. A sudden hush fell over the room as Bjorn, his most trusted scout, burst through the doors, his face flushed with excitement. "Harold! Harold!" Bjorn called out, pushing his way through the crowd. "I bring news from the western shores." Harold's steel-gray eyes snapped to attention, fixing on Bjorn's weathered face. "Speak, my friend. What have you discovered?" Bjorn leaned in close, his voice low and urgent. "A settlement, Harold. One richer than any we've seen before. Gold, silver, and treasures beyond our wildest dreams." A murmur rippled through the gathered warriors, but Harold raised a hand for silence. "And what of its defenses? Surely such wealth does not sit unguarded." Bjorn's expression grew serious. "Aye, there's the rub. The settlement lies beyond the Jotun Mountains, a treacherous journey, with a chasm so deep and wide, it's said to be the mouth of hell itself." Harold stroked his beard, his mind already calculating the risks and rewards. "A challenge worthy of true Vikings," he mused. Then, raising his voice, he addressed the room. "Who among you has the courage to follow me on this perilous quest?" The Longhouse erupted in cheers as warriors leapt to their feet, brandishing axes and swords. Harold nodded in satisfaction, his chest swelling with pride at the loyalty of his men. "Prepare yourselves," he commanded. "We sail with the morning tide." As the excitement built, Harold felt a tug on his arm. He turned to see Astrid, the village's eldest and most respected seer, her blind eyes clouded with concern. "A word, Harold," she whispered, gesturing for him to follow. In a quiet corner of the Longhouse, Astrid gripped Harold's arm with surprising strength. "I've seen visions of your journey, my lord. The path ahead is fraught with danger." Harold's brow furrowed. "All great quests come with risk, Astrid. You know this." The old woman shook her head. "This is different. The mountains hide secrets older than our people. Dark forces lie in wait. Tread carefully lest you awaken that which should remain sleeping." A chill ran down Harold's spine, but he squared his shoulders. "We are Vikings. We do not shy away from danger or the unknown." Astrid sighed, her unseeing eyes seeming to peer into Harold's very soul. "Then take this," she said, pressing a small, rune-carved stone into his hand. "May it guide you when all other paths are lost." Harold closed his fingers around the stone, feeling its warmth pulse against his skin. "Thank you, wise one. I will heed your words." As he turned to rejoin his men, Harold found his path blocked by Sigrid, his wife. Her blue eyes, usually so full of warmth, now blazed with a mix of fury and fear. "So you mean to leave us again?" she said, her voice tight with emotion. Harold reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Sigrid, my love, you know this is the way of our people. The raid will bring wealth and security to our village." Sigrid's laugh was bitter. "And what good is wealth if you're not here to share it? What of security for your own family?" Confusion clouded Harold's features. "What do you mean?" Tears welled in Sigrid's eyes as she took Harold's hand and pressed it to her belly. "I'm with child, Harold. Your child. Would you leave us now when we need you most?" The world seemed to stop for Harold. Joy, fear, and uncertainty warred within him as he processed this news. A child. His child. The continuation of his line. A new generation to carry on his legacy. "Sigrid," he breathed, pulling her close. "This is incredible news. But don't you see? This is why I must go. For our child's future. Sigrid pushed away from him, her face a mask of disbelief. You would risk orphaning your child before it's even born? For what? More gold? More glory? Harold's voice softened. For a better world. One where our child can grow up safe and prosperous. I swear to you, Sigrid, I will return. Don't make promises you can't keep, Sigrid whispered, turning away. Just know that if you leave now, you may return to find things changed beyond repair. As Sigrid disappeared into the crowd, Harold felt the weight of leadership settle heavily on his shoulders. The excitement of the upcoming raid now mingled with a deep, gnawing worry. He made his way back to the great table, where his most trusted warriors awaited his command. Bjorn, ever observant, noticed the change in his leader's demeanor. Is all well, Harold? He asked quietly. Harold forced a smile. All is as it should be, old friend. We have a raid to prepare for. As the night wore on and plans were made, Harold found his mind constantly returning to Sigrid's words and the child growing within her. The call of adventure tugged at his heart, but so too did the bonds of family and responsibility. Dawn broke over the village, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Harold stood at the prow of his longship, watching as his men made final preparations. The weight of the rune stone in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Sigrid stood on the shore, her arms wrapped protectively around her middle. Their eyes met across the water, 1,000 unspoken words passing between them. With a heavy heart, Harold raised his hand in farewell. Set sail, he commanded, his voice carrying over the crash of waves. As the longship pulled away from the shore, Harold felt the familiar thrill of adventure course through his veins. Yet, for the first time, it was tempered by a new emotion, a yearning for home and the family he was leaving behind. The village grew smaller on the horizon, and Harold turned his gaze to the open sea. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with courage and determination. For his men, for his people, for the child he had yet to meet. The greatest adventure of Harold's life had only just begun. The salty spray of the sea whipped across Harold's face as he stood at the helm of his longship, the lead vessel in a fleet of 5. The journey had begun with fair winds and calm seas, but as they ventured further from familiar waters, the mood of the ocean turned treacherous. Dark clouds roiled overhead and the wind howled with increasing ferocity. Harold's knuckles turned white as he gripped the ship's steering oar, his eyes narrowed against the stinging rain. Bjorn, he bellowed over the tempest. Secure those lines, we can't lose the sail now. His trusted friend scrambled across the deck, barking orders to the crew as they fought to keep the ship under control. The other vessels in their small fleet were barely visible through the sheets of rain, their outlines appearing and disappearing like phantoms in the mist. A massive wave crashed over the bow, nearly sweeping 2 men overboard. Harold's heart raced as he watched them cling desperately to the gunwales. Hold fast, men, he shouted, his voice barely audible above the storm's fury. We are Vikings. We do not yield to Rand's embrace so easily. As if in response to his defiance, a fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the chaos around them. In that brief electric moment, Harold caught sight of a monstrous wave bearing down on them. Brace yourselves, he roared, throwing his weight against the steering oar. The ship tilted at a sickening angle as it climbed the face of the wave. For a heart-stopping moment, Harold feared they would capsize. But then, with a mighty groan of timber, the longship crested the wave and plunged down the other side. Hours passed in a blur of wind, rain, and desperate struggle. Finally, as dawn broke, the storm began to subside. Exhausted but triumphant, Harold surveyed his battered fleet. Miraculously, all 5 ships had weathered the tempest. Bjorn approached, his beard still dripping with seawater. By the gods, Harold, I've never seen such a storm. Surely this is an omen. Harold clasped his friend's shoulder. Aye, an omen of our strength and the rightness of our cause. The gods test us, Bjorn, and we have proven worthy. As the day wore on and repairs were made, a cry went up from the watchman. Sails on the horizon. Harold snatched up his spyglass, focusing on the approaching vessels. His blood ran cold as he recognized the markings. "Hrothgar's raiders," he spat. "Prepare for battle." The crew sprang into action, readying weapons and shields. Harold's mind raced, knowing their ships were in no condition for a prolonged fight. As Hrothgar's fleet drew near, Harold made a daring decision. "Hard to starboard," he commanded. "We'll use the current to outmaneuver them." The Vikings executed a series of complex maneuvers, using their superior knowledge of the sea to dance around Hrothgar's larger, slower vessels. Arrows flew and insults were hurled, but Harold's quick thinking allowed them to slip past the enemy raiders with minimal damage. "You fight like old women," Hrothgar's voice carried across the waves. "Run, Harold, run and hide." Harold bit back a retort, knowing that discretion was the better part of valor in this instance. They had a greater prize to seek, and he wouldn't risk it all for pride. Days later, as the coastline of their destination came into view, a palpable sense of relief swept through the fleet. They had survived storm and rival alike, but Harold knew the greatest challenges still lay ahead. As they made landfall and began to unload supplies, Harold gathered his men. "The sea was but the first test," he declared. "Now we face the unknown perils of this foreign land. Stay alert and stay together." The Vikings began their trek inland, hacking through dense primeval forests unlike anything they had seen before. Strange bird calls echoed through the canopy, and unfamiliar tracks marked the forest floor. "Keep your axes ready," Bjorn warned. "There's no telling what beasts lurk in these woods." As if summoned by his words, a monstrous bear burst from the underbrush, roaring its challenge. The Vikings formed a defensive circle, shields locked as Harold stepped forward to face the beast. Man and animal circled each other, neither willing to make the first move. Then, with a speed that belied his size, Harold feinted left and struck right, his axe biting deep into the bear's shoulder. The battle was fierce but brief. In the end, Harold stood victorious over the fallen beast, his men cheering their leader's prowess. "We'll feast well tonight," he grinned, wiping blood from his blade. As they made camp that evening, roasting bear meat over crackling fires, an eerie mist began to creep through the trees. The Vikings grew uneasy, hands straying to weapon hilts as shadows seemed to move of their own accord. From the mist emerged a figure, an old man, bent with age, but with eyes that sparkled with hidden vitality. He leaned heavily on a gnarled staff as he approached the camp. "Hail, warriors from across the sea," the old man called out. "I am Fenwick, a humble traveler in these parts." Harold stepped forward, hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword. "Well met, Fenwick. What brings you to our fire on such a night?" The old man's laugh was like dry leaves rustling. "Why, the same thing that brings all men to journey, the promise of adventure and reward. I couldn't help but overhear your plans to cross the mountains. A perilous journey, to be sure." Bjorn scowled. "And how would you know of our plans, old man?" Fenwick tapped the side of his nose knowingly. "The forest has ears, my friend, and I have long learned to listen. But perhaps it is fortunate that our paths have crossed. I know these mountains well. Every pass, every cave, every treacherous cliff." Harold's eyes narrowed. "You offer to guide us?" "For a price, of course." Fenwick nodded. "Gold equal to the weight of my staff. A fair trade for safe passage, wouldn't you agree?" The Vikings murmured among themselves, suspicion warring with the need for local knowledge. Harold studied the old man carefully, weighing the risks. Finally, he spoke. "And if we refuse your offer?" Fenwick shrugged. "Then you are free to make your own way, but the mountains are unforgiving to those who do not know their secrets. Many have entered, few have returned." Harold felt the weight of his men's eyes upon him, waiting for his decision. The runestone in his pocket seemed to pulse, a reminder of Astrid's warning about the dangers that lay ahead. With a heavy sigh, Harold extended his hand. "Very well, Fenwick. We accept your offer. But know this. If you lead us false, No god in heaven or hell will protect you from my wrath." The old man's grip was surprisingly strong as he shook Harold's hand. A bargain struck then. Rest well, warriors. Tomorrow we begin our ascent into the realm of giants and legends. As Fenwick settled by the fire and the Vikings prepared for sleep, Harold couldn't shake a feeling of unease. He had committed them to this path for better or worse. What secrets did the old man hold, and what hidden agenda might lie behind those twinkling eyes? Harold gazed up at the looming mountains, their peaks lost in swirling clouds. Whatever challenges awaited them, he knew that the real test of their mettle was only just beginning. With a silent prayer to Odin for wisdom and strength, he closed his eyes, ready to face whatever the dawn might bring. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and gold, as Harold and his Vikings began their ascent into the looming mountains. Fenwick, their enigmatic guide, led the way, his gnarled staff tapping a steady rhythm against the rocky path. "Keep close," Harold called back to his men. "These mountains have no love for the unprepared." As they climbed higher, the air grew thin and bitter cold. Swirling mists obscured the path ahead, and treacherous ice coated the narrow ledges they traversed. More than once, a Viking's foot slipped, saved only by the quick reflexes of his comrades. Bjorn, trudging alongside Harold, muttered under his breath, "I mislike this, Harold. The old man leads us on a fool's errand." Harold's eyes never left Fenwick's back as he replied, "Perhaps. But for now, he's our best hope of crossing these accursed mountains. Stay alert, my friend." As the day wore on, the weather worsened. Howling winds whipped snow and ice into a frenzy, stinging exposed skin and making every step a battle. The Vikings huddled together, using their shields as makeshift windbreaks. Suddenly, Fenwick halted, raising his staff. "Beware!" he shouted over the gale. "The path ahead is treacherous. We must move quickly and quietly." No sooner had the words left his lips than a low rumble echoed through the mountains. Harold's eyes widened as he realized the danger. "Avalanche!" he roared. "Run!" The Vikings scrambled for safety as a wall of snow and rock cascaded down the mountainside. Harold pushed his men ahead, ensuring their escape. But as he turned to follow, the ground beneath his feet gave way. Time seemed to slow as Harold fell, the world around him a blur of white. He caught a glimpse of Bjorn's horrified face before the avalanche engulfed him, carrying him down the mountain in a tumult of snow and stone. When the world finally stilled, Harold found himself buried beneath a heavy blanket of snow. With desperate strength, he clawed his way to the surface, gasping as frigid air filled his lungs. "Bjorn!" he called out. "Anyone!" His voice echoed across the desolate landscape, met only by the mournful howl of the wind. As the snow settled, Harold realized with growing dread that he had been separated from half of his men. A familiar tapping sound drew his attention. Fenwick emerged from the swirling snow, seemingly unscathed by the avalanche. "Ah, good," the old man nodded. "You survive. Come, we must find shelter before night falls." Harold's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What of my men? We must search for survivors." Fenwick shook his head. "No time. The mountain is angry today. More slides will come. I know of a safe place, but we must hurry." Reluctantly, Harold followed the guide, his mind racing with questions and doubts. As they trudged through the snow, Fenwick began to speak, his voice carrying an odd note of excitement. "These mountains are older than time itself," he said. "They hold secrets unknown to mortal men, passages that lead to realms beyond imagination." Harold's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword. "What kind of passages?" Fenwick's eyes gleamed in the fading light. "Oh, passages that could lead a man to power beyond measure, to treasures that would make your raid seem like child's play. But such things are not for the faint of heart." Before Harold could press further, a war cry split the air. Figures emerged from the snow, clad in furs and brandishing crude but effective weapons. "Mountain folk," Fenwick hissed. territorial and not fond of outsiders. Harold raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. A tall, broad-shouldered man who seemed to be the leader of the mountain tribe stepped forward, his face painted with intricate blue designs. "Who dares trespass on the sacred slopes of the Sky Fathers?" the leader demanded, in a heavily accented voice. Harold met the man's gaze steadily. "I am Harold, a warrior from across the sea. We seek only safe passage through your mountains." The tribal leader spat on the ground. "Lowlanders are not welcome here. The mountains demand blood for your trespass." Fennec stepped forward, his demeanor suddenly changed. He spoke to the tribal leader in a language Harold didn't understand, gesturing animatedly. The mountain folk listened intently, their expressions shifting from hostility to curiosity. Finally, the leader turned back to Harold. "The Old One says you are a great warrior, chosen by the gods. Prove your worth, and we may yet grant you passage." Harold nodded solemnly. "Name your challenge." A circle was quickly formed in the snow. The tribal leader pointed to a massive warrior among his people. "Defeat Korg in unarmed combat. If you win, you may pass. If you lose, your blood will appease the mountain spirits." As Harold stepped into the circle, he could feel the weight of many eyes upon him. This was more than just a test of strength. It was a chance to gain valuable allies in this harsh, unforgiving land. Korg charged like an enraged bear, but Harold was ready. Using the larger man's momentum against him, Harold sidestepped and sent Korg tumbling into the snow. The battle that followed was fierce and evenly matched. Both men landed punishing blows, their grunts of effort echoing off the mountainsides. As the fight wore on, Harold realized that brute strength alone would not win the day. He needed to outsmart his opponent. Remembering an old wrestling trick from his youth, Harold allowed Korg to grab him in a bear hug. Then, using all his remaining strength, he shifted his weight and flipped Korg over his hip, slamming the mountain warrior onto his back. Before Korg could recover, Harold pinned him, one arm pressed against the man's throat. "Yield," Harold growled. For a tense moment, silence reigned. Then, unexpectedly, Korg began to laugh. "A worthy opponent," he boomed. "The lowlander fights with the spirit of the mountain." The tribal leader stepped forward, a newfound respect in his eyes. "You have proven your worth, Herald of the Sea. Few can best Korg in combat." Harold helped Korg to his feet, the two warriors exchanging nods of mutual respect. "We seek no quarrel with your people," Harold said. "Only safe passage and, if you're willing, guidance through these treacherous peaks." The leader stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Perhaps the Old One spoke true. Perhaps you are indeed chosen by the gods." He extended his hand. "I am Thorgar, chief of the Sky Clan. Come, share our fire and tell us of your journey. We will discuss how we might aid one another." As Harold followed Thorgar to the tribal encampment, he caught sight of Fennec watching from the shadows, a cryptic smile playing on the old man's lips. The guide's earlier words about secret passages and untold power echoed in Harold's mind, mixing with Astrid's warnings of dark forces. The Viking leader knew that while he had overcome one challenge, many more lay ahead. The mountain's true test was yet to come, and Harold couldn't shake the feeling that Fennec's role in their journey was far more complex than that of a simple guide. As the Sky Clan welcomed them with wary hospitality, Harold resolved to keep his wits about him. He had a raid to complete, men to reunite with, and a family waiting for his return. Whatever secrets these ancient mountains held, whatever agenda Fennec might be hiding, Harold was determined to see his quest through to the end. The reunited Viking party trudged through the thinning mountain air, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Harold led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the mist-shrouded path ahead. Bjorn walked beside him, still nursing wounds from the avalanche that had separated them days earlier. "I still can't believe we found each other," Bjorn muttered, his voice hoarse from the cold. "It's as if the gods themselves guided us back together." Harold nodded grimly. "Aye, but I fear the gods have more trials in store for us yet." As if in answer to his words, the mist suddenly parted. revealing a sight that made even the hardened Vikings gasp in awe and terror. Before them yawned a chasm so wide and deep that its bottom was lost in swirling clouds far below. Fennek, their enigmatic guide, stepped forward, his eyes glinting with an unreadable emotion. "Behold," he announced, "the Gulf of Souls. Legend says it was carved by the gods themselves as a test for those who would seek greatness." Harold approached the edge cautiously, peering into the abyss. "And how exactly are we meant to cross this test of the gods?" With a theatrical flourish, Fennek pointed to their left. There, barely visible through the mist, hung an ancient rope bridge. Its weathered planks and fraying ropes swayed gently in the bitter wind. "You've got to be joking," one of the Vikings muttered. "That thing looks like it would barely hold a child, let alone a party of warriors." Fennek shrugged. "It is the only way across. Unless, of course, you've grown wings since we began our journey." Harold studied the bridge intently, his mind racing with calculations and possibilities. "It's risky, but we've come too far to turn back now. We'll cross in small groups to distribute the weight." As the Vikings began to prepare for the crossing, checking their gear and saying quiet prayers to their gods, Harold noticed Fennek edging away from the group. "Where are you going, old man?" Harold called out, suspicion creeping into his voice. Fennek turned, an innocent expression on his weathered face. "Nature calls, my friend. Surely even a guide is allowed a moment of privacy." Before Harold could protest, Fennek had disappeared into the mist. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of the Viking leader's stomach. "I don't like this, Harold," Bjorn growled. "That old fox has been leading us by the nose since we met him. Who knows what game he's really playing?" Harold nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Keep the men ready. I fear our true test is yet to come." As the first group of Vikings tentatively began to cross the bridge, Harold kept his eyes fixed on the far side of the chasm. Something about the swirling mists and shadows didn't sit right with him. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Harold squinted, trying to pierce the veil of mist. There it was again, definite signs of activity on the other side of the gorge. "Hold!" Harold bellowed to his men on the bridge. "Something's not right. Get back here now!" The Vikings on the bridge froze, caught between their leader's command and the precarious swaying of the ancient structure. As they began to carefully make their way back, a chilling laugh echoed across the chasm. From the mist on the far side emerged a familiar figure, Fennek. But he was not alone. Flanking him were dozens of armed warriors, their weapons glinting dully in the dim light. "Oh, Harold," Fennek called out, his voice dripping with mock disappointment. "I had so hoped you'd make it at least halfway across before we sprung our little surprise." Harold's face darkened with rage. Treacherous old snake. What is the meaning of this? Fennek's benign mask fell away, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "Did you really think I was just some humble mountain guide? You Vikings are so predictable, always chasing after glory and gold. It made you embarrassingly easy to manipulate." As Fennek spoke, more warriors emerged from hidden positions around the Vikings, effectively surrounding them. Harold and his men formed a defensive circle, weapons at the ready. "You see," Fennek continued, clearly relishing his moment of triumph, "these mountains and the treasures they hold are under my protection. I couldn't very well let a band of Norse barbarians plunder them, could I? So I devised a little test, one that you've failed quite spectacularly, I'm afraid." Harold's mind raced, searching for a way out of this trap. "And what now, Fennek? You mean to kill us all?" The old man's laugh was cold and mirthless. "Kill you? Oh no. That would be such a waste. You and your men will make excellent slaves in the mines below. The gods know we could use some fresh, strong backs to replace the ones that have worn out." A ripple of angry murmurs ran through the Viking ranks. Harold raised his voice, addressing both his men and their captors. "We are Vikings. We do not bow, we do not break, and we certainly don't become slaves to treacherous old men and their lackeys." With a roar of defiance, Harold charged towards the bridge, his men following close behind. Fenix warriors, momentarily stunned by the Vikings' audacity, scrambled to intercept them. "Stop them, you fools!" Fenix screeched. "Don't let them cross!" The narrow path leading to the bridge became a chaotic battlefield. Vikings clashed with Fenix warriors, the sounds of steel on steel echoing across the chasm. Harold fought like a man possessed, his axe cleaving a path through the enemy ranks. "Bjorn!" Harold shouted over the din of battle. "Get the men across the bridge, I'll hold them here." Bjorn hesitated for a split second, torn between obeying his leader and staying to fight by his side. But he knew Harold's order made tactical sense. "Aye, Harold. May the gods watch over you." As Bjorn led the Vikings onto the swaying bridge, Harold stood his ground at the entrance, a one-man bulwark against the tide of enemies. His axe rose and fell in a deadly rhythm, each stroke felling an opponent. Fenix, seeing his plan unraveling, pushed his way to the front lines. "You fool," he spat at Harold. "You're only prolonging the inevitable. Even if your men make it across, they'll be cut down on the other side." Harold grinned fiercely, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "Perhaps, but they'll die as free men, not slaves. Can you say the same of your warriors, old man?" With a snarl of rage, Fenix raised his staff, which began to glow with an unearthly light. "Enough of this farce. I'll deal with you myself, Viking." As Fenix prepared to unleash whatever arcane power he commanded, a thunderous crack split the air. All eyes turned to the bridge, where the ancient ropes had begun to fray under the weight of the crossing Vikings. "Harold," Bjorn's voice carried across the chasm. "The bridge is failing. We can't hold it much longer." Time seemed to slow for Harold as he assessed his options. With a silent prayer to Odin, he made his decision. In one fluid motion, he dodged Fenix's magical attack, scooped up a fallen enemy's sword, and hurled it with all his might at the bridge's remaining support ropes. The sword sliced through the weathered fibers like a hot knife through butter. With a groan of protest, the bridge began to collapse, taking with it the remaining Vikings and several of Fenix's warriors who had pursued them onto the rickety structure. "No," Fenix howled, realizing too late Harold's desperate gambit. As the bridge fell away, Harold caught a last glimpse of Bjorn's face, a mix of shock, understanding, and grim determination. Then his view was obscured by a surging mass of enemies, all thoughts of slavery forgotten in their desire for vengeance. Harold raised his axe one final time, a battle cry on his lips. He might die here, far from home and the family he loved, but he would do so ensuring his men had a fighting chance. As he prepared to meet his fate, Harold couldn't help but wonder, had he made the right choice? And what challenges awaited those of his crew who had made it across the Gulf of Souls? The answers to these questions would have to wait. Harold's heart pounded in his chest as he led his men onto the ancient rope bridge spanning the Gulf of Souls. The weathered planks creaked ominously beneath their feet, and the entire structure swayed in the bitter mountain wind. Behind them, Fenix warriors were regrouping, their angry shouts carried on the wind. "Quickly, men!" Harold called out, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "We cross in groups of 3. Move swiftly but carefully." Bjorn, ever loyal, stayed close to his leader. "Harold," he muttered, "this feels like madness. That bridge looks as if it could give way at any moment." Harold nodded grimly. "Aye, but it's our only chance. Better to risk the bridge than face certain death or slavery at the hands of that treacherous old fox." As the first group of Vikings made their way across, the mist parted momentarily, revealing the dizzying drop below. Several men muttered prayers to Thor and Odin, their knuckles white as they gripped the fraying rope handrails. Suddenly, a shout from behind made Harold spin around. To his horror, he saw Fenix's men had reached the near side of the bridge. Worse still, they were hacking at the support ropes with their blades. "They're cutting the ropes," Harold roared. "Move, you dogs. Move as if hell herself were at your heels." The urgency in their leader's voice spurred the Vikings to greater speed. Men who had been inching across now broke into cautious jogs, the bridge swaying alarmingly beneath them. Harold found himself in the middle of the bridge, urging his men forward while keeping a wary eye on the enemy's progress. The ropes groaned under the increased strain, fibers snapping one by one. Suddenly, a cry of terror split the air. Harold turned to see Ulf, one of his youngest warriors, lose his footing on a rotting plank. The boy teetered on the edge, arms windmilling desperately. Without a second thought, Harold lunged for Ulf, his strong hand closing around the young Viking's wrist just as he began to fall. For a heart-stopping moment, both men hung suspended over the abyss, Harold's other hand white-knuckled on the rope railing. "I've got you, lad," Harold grunted, muscles straining as he hauled Ulf back onto the bridge. "On your feet now. We're not done yet." Ulf nodded, his face pale but determined. "Thank you, Harold. I won't forget this." No sooner had they regained their footing than a sickening snap echoed across the chasm. One of the main support ropes had given way, causing the bridge to lurch violently to one side. "The bridge is failing!" Bjorn shouted from further ahead. "We need to move now!" Harold pushed Ulf ahead of him. "Go! Don't look back! Just run!" The remaining Vikings abandoned all caution, sprinting across the wildly swinging bridge. Planks cracked and splintered beneath their feet, entire sections falling away into the mist-shrouded depths below. Another support rope snapped, the sound like a crack of doom in Harold's ears. The bridge twisted, nearly vertical now, forcing the men to cling to the remaining ropes and planks. "Climb!" Harold bellowed, his voice hoarse with exertion. "Climb for your lives!" Hand over hand, the Vikings clawed their way up the disintegrating structure. Harold brought up the rear, his powerful arms straining as he pulled himself upward. Above him, he could see Bjorn reaching down, urging the men on to safety. With a groan of protesting wood and rope, the bridge gave one final shudder. Harold looked up to see the last support rope fraying rapidly, mere moments from snapping entirely. "Harold!" Bjorn's panic-stricken face appeared above him. "Jump! For Odin's sake, jump now!" Summoning every ounce of strength left in his battered body, Harold coiled himself and leaped upward. Time seemed to slow as he flew through the air, the chasm yawning beneath him, hungry for one final victim. Just as the last rope snapped, Harold's outstretched hand found Bjorn's. With a mighty heave, Bjorn and several other Vikings pulled their leader to safety on the far side of the Gulf of Souls. Harold collapsed onto solid ground, his chest heaving as he gulped in great breaths of the thin mountain air. Around him, his men were in similar states of exhaustion and disbelief at their narrow escape. "By Thor's hammer," Ulf gasped. "I can't believe we made it." Bjorn helped Harold to his feet, a rare smile breaking through his weathered features. "I thought we'd lost you there at the end, old friend." Harold clasped Bjorn's shoulder, his eyes scanning the group. Relief washed over him as he realized that every one of his men had made it across. But the relief was short-lived as he turned to survey the scene behind them. The bridge was gone, leaving nothing but a few frayed ropes dangling from the cliff face. On the far side, Fennek and his warriors raged impotently, their prize snatched from their grasp at the last moment. "You haven't won anything, Harold," Fennek's voice carried faintly across the chasm. "You've only delayed the inevitable. These mountains will be your tomb." Harold allowed himself a grim smile. "Perhaps," he called back, "but we'll face whatever comes as free men, not slaves." Turning to his men, Harold's voice took on a tone of quiet determination. "We've survived the avalanche, outsmarted a treacherous guide, and crossed the Gulf of Souls itself. Whatever challenges lie ahead, we'll face them together." A ragged cheer went up from the Vikings, their spirits bolstered by their leader's words and their incredible escape. As the adrenaline of their crossing began to fade, the realities of their situation set in. They were stranded on an unknown mountain, their supplies left behind, with no clear path forward and no way back. Bjorn voiced the thought on everyone's mind. "What now, Harold? We're alive, but for how long in this frozen wasteland?" Harold gazed into the mist-shrouded peaks looming before them. Somewhere beyond those snow-capped giants lay their goal, the fabled treasure that had lured them on this perilous quest. But at what cost? And was it truly worth the lives of his men? For a moment, doubt clouded Harold's mind. Had he led his loyal warriors to their doom? Was Fennec right? Would these mountains be their tomb? Pushing aside his fears, Harold straightened his back and addressed his men. Now, we do what Vikings have always done. We push forward. We adapt. We survive. Our goal lies somewhere beyond these peaks, and by Odin, we will reach it or die trying. A chorus of agreement rose from the battered but unbroken band of warriors. As one, they turned their backs on the Gulf of Souls and began the arduous climb into the unknown heights beyond. As they marched, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The bridge crossing had been harrowing, but it was likely just a taste of the trials to come. Whatever fate awaited them in these cursed mountains, Harold swore to himself that he would see his men through it, or perish in the attempt. With each step taking them further into uncharted territory, the Vikings steeled themselves for whatever perils lay hidden in the swirling mists ahead. The real test of their courage, strength, and loyalty was only just beginning. The clash of steel on steel echoed across the chasm as Harold fought with all his might against the onslaught of enemies. His axe sang a deadly song, each swing felling another of Fennec's warriors. But for every foe that fell, 2 more seemed to take their place. "Hold the line," Harold roared, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "We die here as free men or not at all." Bjorn, separated from his leader by the collapsing bridge, watched in helpless fury from the far side of the Gulf of Souls. "We need to find a way across," he bellowed to the Vikings around him. "Harold can't hold them off forever." The men scrambled along the cliff edge, searching desperately for any alternative path. But the chasm yawned wide and deep, offering no easy crossing. Back at the bridge's remnants, Harold found himself slowly being pushed back towards the precipice. His arms burned with fatigue, each parry and strike requiring more effort than the last. Yet he fought on, his fierce determination keeping exhaustion at bay. Suddenly, the press of enemies parted, and Fennec stepped forward. Gone was the benign mask of the humble mountain guide. In its place was a visage of cruel power, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Enough of this farce," Fennec snarled, his voice resonating with otherworldly energy. "You've proven yourself a worthy adversary, Harold, but your time has come to an end." With a gesture, Fennec's staff began to pulse with dark energy. The air around him shimmered and distorted, as if reality itself was bending to his will. "By the gods," one of Harold's men gasped. "He's no mere guide, he's a sorcerer." Harold gripped his axe tighter, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Aye, and a coward who hides behind magic tricks. Face me like a man, Fennec, if you've the courage." Fennec's laughter was cold and mirthless. "Oh, you simple, brutish creature. You have no idea of the powers you're dealing with." With a wave of his staff, tendrils of dark energy lashed out, knocking Harold's remaining men off their feet. Harold stood alone now, the last bulwark between Fennec's sorcery and his comrades struggling to find a crossing. He raised his axe in defiance, even as doubt began to creep into his heart. How could he hope to defeat an enemy who commanded such fell powers? As if in answer to his unspoken question, the world around Harold seemed to shimmer and fade. The sounds of battle receded, replaced by an otherworldly silence. And there, standing before him as real as the day he'd left her, was Astrid, his beloved wife. "Astrid?" Harold whispered, his voice choked with emotion. How is this possible?" Astrid's smile was radiant, filled with love and pride. "My brave Harold," she said, her voice carrying on a phantom wind. "You have come so far, endured so much, but your greatest test lies before you." "I don't know if I have the strength," Harold admitted, his usual confidence wavering. "This enemy, he wields powers beyond my understanding." Astrid reached out, her hand seemingly solid as it cupped Harold's cheek. "You have a strength that no sorcery can match, my love. It lies not in your arm or your axe, but in your heart. Remember who you are, why you fight. Let that be your shield and your weapon." With those words, Astrid's image began to fade. Harold reached out, desperate to hold on to this moment, but his hands grasped only air. As quickly as it had come, the vision vanished, leaving Harold once more on the battlefield. The night air crackled with an otherworldly energy as Harold and his Viking warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with the valley settlers. For days now, they had been fighting off increasingly violent supernatural attacks, each one more terrifying than the last. "Hold the line," Harold bellowed, his voice carrying over the chaos of battle. Shadowy figures with glowing red eyes clawed at their makeshift barricades, their unearthly shrieks sending chills down even the bravest warrior's spine. Bjorn, his face streaked with blood and soot, swung his axe in a wide arc, cleaving through 3 of the spectral beings. "By Odin's beard, Harold, what manner of hell have we stumbled into?" Harold had no answer. Since discovering the mysterious artifact in the abandoned temple, strange occurrences had plagued them. At first, it was merely unsettling noises in the night and unexplained cold spots. But now, they faced an all-out assault from forces beyond their understanding. As the battle raged on, Harold felt the artifact pulse against his chest where he kept it hidden. A searing pain shot through his head, and suddenly, the world around him fell away. He found himself standing in a vast dark chamber. Before him loomed a monstrous figure, bound in chains of glowing energy. Its form shifted constantly, a writhing mass of shadows and flame. When it spoke, its voice was like the grinding of mountains. "Freedom, at last," it rasped. "The seal weakens. Soon I shall walk the world once more, and all shall tremble before me." The vision shifted, and Harold saw scenes of devastation. Entire cities laid waste, the sky choked with ash and hordes of demonic creatures swarming across the land. As quickly as it had come, the vision faded. Harold stumbled, nearly dropping his sword. Ulf, the young warrior he had saved on the bridge, steadied him. "Harold, are you all right?" Ulf's voice was filled with concern. Before Harold could respond, another wave of attackers crashed against their defenses. The battle wore on through the night, but eventually, as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the shadowy assailants retreated. The settlers and Vikings gathered in the village center, tending to their wounded and assessing the damage. Astrid, the village elder, approached Harold with a grave expression. "The attacks grow worse," she said, her voice weary. "I fear we cannot withstand much more." Harold nodded grimly. "I saw something. A vision, I think. There's a demon, imprisoned somewhere. I believe it's the source of these attacks." A hush fell over the gathered crowd. Astrid's eyes widened. "The ancient evil," she whispered. "The legends speak of a demon imprisoned by our ancestors, but the seal was supposed to last for eternity." Before Harold could respond, pain lanced through his head once more. This time, when the world refocused, he saw a sight that made his blood run cold. There, standing before him, was Ingrid, his wife. Her face was etched with worry and fear. "Harold," she said, her voice echoing as if from a great distance. "You must return home. A great danger approaches our village. Without you, we are defenseless. Please, Harold, we need you." "Ingrid!" Harold cried out, reaching for her. But his hand passed through her form like smoke, and she faded away. Harold fell to his knees, his mind reeling. The choice that now lay before him seemed impossible. Stay and help these people fight an ancient evil, or return home to protect his family and village. As he grappled with this dilemma, a soft glow began to emanate from the nearby woods. The settlers gasped and pointed as a figure emerged, a woman of ethereal beauty, her form seeming to shift between human and something other. "I am the guardian spirit of this valley," she announced, her voice like the whisper of wind through leaves. "For millennia I have watched over these lands and kept the demon's prison secure, but now the seal weakens and I cannot stop its breaking alone." Her gaze fell on Harold. "You, Viking, bear the key to the demon's prison, the artifact you found in the temple. It was hidden there long ago, meant to be found only in the direst need. With it, we may be able to reinforce the seal and prevent the demon's release. Harold's hand went to the artifact hanging around his neck. But my home, my family, they're in danger. I saw it. The spirit's eyes softened with sympathy. The demon seeks to manipulate you, Harold. It knows that you are the key to its freedom or continued imprisonment. The vision of your wife was a deception, meant to lure you away from here when you are needed most. Conflict raged within Harold. Could he trust this spirit? What if the vision of Ingrid was real? How could he choose between his duty to his family and the fate of an entire valley, perhaps even the world? Bjorn stepped forward, placing a hand on Harold's shoulder. Whatever you decide, old friend, we stand with you. The other Vikings nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination despite their exhaustion. Harold closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, they blazed with resolve. "Very well," he said to the spirit. "Tell me what must be done to stop this demon." The guardian spirit nodded solemnly. "The path ahead is fraught with peril. We must journey to the heart of the mountain, where the demon is imprisoned. There, with the artifact and my power combined, we may be able to reinforce the seal. But be warned," she continued, her voice grave. "The demon will throw every terror and temptation in our path. It will try to break your will, to turn you against each other. Only by standing united do we have any hope of success." Harold turned to address the settlers and his fellow Vikings. "You've all heard what's at stake. I won't force anyone to come on this journey. It may very well be a path to certain death. But if we do nothing, death will surely come for us all." A moment of silence fell over the gathering. Then, one by one, hands raised. First the Vikings, then the settlers. Astrid stepped forward, her aged face set with determination. "This valley has been our home for generations," she said. "We will fight to protect it, no matter the cost." Harold felt a swell of pride and determination. He raised his sword high. "Then let us go and face this evil, for our homes, for our families, for the future of all." A cheer went up from the assembled crowd. As they began to prepare for the perilous journey ahead, Harold felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He had made his choice, but the consequences of that decision remained to be seen. As the first group of warriors and settlers readied themselves to depart, Harold cast one last look at the peaceful valley below. Whatever trials lay ahead in the heart of the mountain, he swore to himself that he would see this through. The fate of not just this valley, but perhaps the entire world, now rested in their hands. With a final nod to the guardian spirit, Harold led the way towards the looming peak, the artifact pulsing against his chest like a second heartbeat. The true test of their courage, strength, and unity was about to begin. The air crackled with tension as Harold stood before his assembled warriors and the valley settlers. The weight of his decision pressed heavily upon him, but his voice remained steady as he addressed the group. "My friends, my brothers in arms," he began, his eyes sweeping over the faces of those who had fought beside him through so much. "The time has come for our greatest challenge yet. We stand as the last line of defense against an evil that threatens not just this valley, but the entire world." Harold's gaze fell upon Eric, his most trusted warrior after Bjorn. "Eric, I have a task for you that requires all your strength and speed. You must return to our homeland, to my wife Ingrid. Tell her of what has transpired here, and of the danger that looms. Warn our people to be vigilant, to prepare for dark times ahead." Eric stepped forward, his face a mixture of determination and reluctance. "Harold, my chief, I would rather stay and fight by your side." Harold clasped the man's shoulder firmly. "I know, old friend, but this task is of utmost importance. Our people must be warned, and Ingrid, she must know why I cannot return. Can I trust you with this?" Eric nodded solemnly. "With my life, Harold. I will not fail you." As Eric prepared for his long journey, Harold turned his attention back to the impending battle. The guardian spirit of the valley materialized beside him, her ethereal form shimmering with barely contained energy. "The demon stirs," she warned, her voice like wind through leaves. "Its prison weakens with each passing moment. We must act now." No sooner had the words left her lips than the ground began to tremble. A deafening roar echoed from the mountains, and the sky darkened as if night had fallen in an instant. "It's breaking free!" Bjorn shouted, raising his axe. From the peak of the tallest mountain, a column of dark energy erupted, reaching into the roiling clouds above. As the Vikings and settlers watched in horror, a figure emerged from the maelstrom. The defeated sorcerer Fennek, his body twisted and warped by the demon's possession. When he spoke, it was with a voice that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. "Fools! You thought to imprison me for eternity. Now witness the futility of your resistance." With a gesture from Fennek's gnarled hand, the earth split open. From the chasms poured forth an army of nightmarish creatures, twisted abominations of shadow and flame, led by spectral warriors astride skeletal steeds. Harold raised his sword high, its blade glinting in the unnatural darkness. "Stand fast," he roared to his forces. "We are the last hope for this world. Fight not just for yourselves, but for all who would fall, should we fail here today." The Vikings let out a thunderous battle cry taken up by the settlers who stood with them. As one, they charged to meet the oncoming horde of darkness. The clash of steel on otherworldly bone and flesh filled the air. Harold found himself in the thick of the melee, his sword a blur as he cut down demon after demon. Beside him, Bjorn's axe sang its deadly song, while the settlers fought with a ferocity born of defending their homes and loved ones. Through the chaos of battle, Harold caught glimpses of the possessed Fennek. The sorcerer-turned demon vessel hovered above the fray, hurling bolts of dark energy that left smoking craters in the earth. "We need to reach him," Harold shouted to the guardian spirit, who was using her own powers to hold back waves of shadowy creatures. "How can we stop him?" The spirit's voice echoed in Harold's mind. "The artifact. Its true purpose is revealed in this darkest hour. It is not just a key, but a weapon forged to combat this very evil." Harold's hand flew to the artifact hanging around his neck. As his fingers touched its surface, he felt a surge of power course through him. Suddenly he knew what he had to do. "Cover me," he yelled to Bjorn and the others near him. "I'm going for Fennek." Fighting his way through the demon army, Harold made for a rocky outcropping that would bring him closer to the hovering sorcerer. Demons fell before his empowered blade, which now glowed with an inner light that seared the dark creatures. As Harold reached the top of the outcropping, he found himself face to face with the possessed Fennek. The sorcerer's eyes, now burning pits of hellfire, fixed upon him. "So, the would-be hero approaches," the demon sneered through Fennek's twisted mouth. "Do you truly think you can stand against me, mortal?" Harold stood his ground, the artifact pulsing with energy against his chest. "I don't stand alone," he replied, his voice steady. "I carry the hopes and strength of all those who fight below, and the power of those who imprisoned you long ago." With a roar of defiance, Harold leapt at Fennek, the artifact held before him like a shield. The demon shrieked, a sound of both rage and fear. As they collided, a blinding light erupted from the artifact. Harold felt himself being pulled into a vortex of energy, Fennek's possessed form trapped with him in the maelstrom. Time seemed to slow as Harold realized the true cost of using the artifact's power. To imprison the demon once more, he would have to sacrifice himself as well. In that moment of clarity, Harold saw flashes of his life, his village back home, the face of his beloved Ingrid, the adventures he had shared with his loyal warriors. A sense of peace washed over him as he accepted his fate. "Harold!" Bjorn's anguished cry cut through the roar of energy. "No!" Harold met his old friend's eyes one last time. "Tell our people I died with honor," he called out, "and tell Ingrid, tell her I love her." With those final words, Harold embraced his destiny. He pulled the demon closer, even as its claws raked at him, and plunged them both deeper into the artifact's power. There was a deafening crack, like thunder splitting the sky, and then silence. Where Harold and the possessed Fennec had been, there was now only empty air. The artifact fell to the ground, smoking slightly but otherwise unmarked. All across the battlefield, the demon's army began to disintegrate. Without their master to sustain them, they crumbled to ash and were swept away by a sudden cleansing wind. Bjorn fell to his knees beside the artifact, his weathered face etched with grief. The other Vikings and settlers gathered around, their victory hollowed by the loss of their leader. The guardian spirit materialized once more, her form seeming more solid now that the demon's influence had been banished. She bent and gently picked up the artifact. "Harold's sacrifice has saved us all," she said, her voice filled with both sorrow and reverence. "He and the demon are now imprisoned within the artifact, locked in eternal battle. So long as the artifact remains intact, the world is safe from this evil." Bjorn stood slowly, taking the artifact from the spirit with trembling hands. "Then we shall guard it with our lives," he vowed, "for Harold, and for all he fought to protect." As the sun finally broke through the dissipating dark clouds, the survivors began to tend to their wounded and honor their fallen. The battle was over, but its effects would be felt for generations to come. In the days that followed, tales of Harold's heroism spread throughout the valley and beyond. A shrine was built to house the artifact, guarded day and night by both Vikings and settlers. The two groups, once strangers, now bound together by shared struggle and sacrifice. And far to the north, in a small Viking village, a lone warrior named Eric arrived with heavy news for a waiting wife. Ingrid listened with tears in her eyes as Eric recounted Harold's bravery and his final message of love. Though Harold was gone, his legacy lived on. In the peace he had won for the valley, in the alliance forged between Vikings and settlers, and in the stories that would be told of his final, selfless act for generations to come. As the shrine of the artifact stood as a silent sentinel against future darkness, those who knew the truth of what had transpired there could not help but wonder. In the eternal battle raging within the artifact, was Harold still fighting, even now, to keep the world safe from evil? The longship's dragon-headed prow cut through the frigid northern waters, its sail billowing with the wind of home. On board, Harold's men stood silent, their faces etched with a mixture of weariness and sorrow. The journey back had been long, but the weight of their tale bore heavier upon them than any physical burden. As the familiar coastline of their homeland came into view, Bjorn, now the de facto leader of the group, turned to address his comrades. "Brothers," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "we return not in triumph, but in honor. Our task now is to ensure Harold's sacrifice is never forgotten." Eirik, who had arrived weeks earlier to deliver the initial news, waited on the shore with a group of villagers. As the ship docked and the warriors disembarked, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. Bjorn approached Ingrid, Harold's wife, her swollen belly a poignant reminder of life's continuity, even in the face of loss. He knelt before her, offering up Harold's sword and helmet. "My lady," he said, his voice thick, "Harold fell as he lived, with courage and honor. His sacrifice saved not just the valley we sought to claim, but perhaps the entire world from an ancient evil." Ingrid accepted the items with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. "Tell me everything," she whispered. "I would know how my husband spent his final days." As the village gathered in the Great Hall, Bjorn recounted their harrowing tale, the treacherous guide, the perilous bridge crossing, the mysterious valley, and the final, cataclysmic battle against the demon. He spoke of Harold's bravery, his leadership, and his ultimate sacrifice. "Though Harold is gone from this world," Bjorn concluded, "his spirit lives on in all of us who witnessed his courage, and it will live on in his child, who will be born knowing their father was the greatest of heroes." A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. As if on cue, Ingrid suddenly gasped, clutching her belly. "The baby," she breathed. "It's coming." What followed was a night of both joy and sorrow. As the village midwife tended to Ingrid, the warriors held vigil, sharing stories of Harold's life and deeds. Outside, the aurora borealis danced across the sky, as if the gods themselves were honoring the fallen hero. As dawn broke, a cry pierced the air. Not one but two voices raising in unison. Bjorn rushed into the birthing chamber to find an exhausted but radiant Ingrid cradling two tiny bundles. "Twins," the midwife announced, her voice filled with wonder. "A boy and a girl. In all my years, I've never seen the like. They came into this world together, hands clasped as if neither would enter without the other." Ingrid looked up at Bjorn, her eyes shining. "The boy shall be called Harold after his father, and the girl, Astrid, for the brave elder who stood with you in that distant valley." As Bjorn gazed upon the newborns, he could have sworn he saw a flicker of otherworldly light pass between them, but he dismissed it as a trick of the morning sun. Years passed, and the legend of Harold the Demon Slayer grew throughout the Viking world. Skalds composed epic poems of his deeds, and parents named their children after him in hopes of bestowing some of his courage upon them. In the village, young Harold and Astrid grew into fine young adults, each bearing signs of their extraordinary heritage. Harold possessed his father's strength and leadership, quickly becoming a skilled warrior and respected voice in the community. Astrid, on the other hand, displayed gifts of a more mysterious nature, an affinity for the old magics, and a connection to the natural world that both awed and slightly unnerved those around her. On the eve of their 20th birthday, as the twins sat by the shore watching the sunset, Astrid suddenly stiffened, her eyes going wide. "Harold," she whispered, gripping her brother's arm. "Do you see him?" Before them, shimmering like a mirage, stood the spectral image of their father. Though they had never seen him in life, they knew him instantly. His face was lined with weariness, but his eyes burned with an indomitable spirit. "My children," the apparition spoke, its voice seeming to come from a great distance. "I have fought for 20 years to reach you. The demon's prison weakens, and with it the barrier that separates us. I need your help." Young Harold leapt to his feet, hand instinctively going to the sword at his hip, the very blade his father had wielded. "Father, tell us what to do. We'll face any danger to bring you home." The ghost of Harold smiled sadly. "Brave words, my son, but the task before you is more perilous than you can imagine. The artifact that imprisons both me and the demon lies in the valley where I fell." The crisp morning air carried the scent of salt and pine as Ragnar and Bjorn stood atop the cliff overlooking their village. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the fjord. The two men, friends since childhood, gazed out at the scene in comfortable silence. Ragnar, tall and broad-shouldered with flowing red hair, turned to his companion with a grin. "Do you remember, Bjorn, when we were boys and we'd sneak out here to watch the ships return?" Bjorn, slightly shorter but no less imposing, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, chuckled. "Aye. How could I forget? We'd race each other to this very spot, pretending we were the great warriors returning from glorious battles. And now look at us," Ragnar mused, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "No longer pretending, but living the life we once dreamed of." Bjorn nodded, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "We've come a long way from those two mischievous boys who couldn't even lift a proper axe." As they stood there, memories flooded back, vivid and cherished. Ragnar recalled the time they had stolen a small fishing boat, determined to prove themselves as worthy seafarers. "Remember that time we borrowed old Ericsson's boat?" Bjorn burst into laughter. "How could I forget? We barely made it past the harbor before capsizing. Ericsson was furious. But it was worth it," Ragnar added, his eyes twinkling with mirth. We learned more about sailing that day than we ever did from the elders' lectures. Their laughter echoed across the cliffside, a testament to the bond forged through years of shared adventures and hardships. As their mirth subsided, Bjorn's expression grew more serious. "We've had our fair share of close calls, haven't we, Ragnar?" he said, his voice low. Ragnar nodded, understanding the weight of his friend's words. "Aye, that we have. But we've always pulled through, together." A comfortable silence fell between them once more, broken only by the distant sounds of the village coming to life below. The moment was interrupted by the approach of a young warrior, breathless from his climb. "Ragnar! Bjorn!" the young man called out. "The scouts have returned. They bring news of a rich village to the south, ripe for raiding." Ragnar and Bjorn exchanged a look, a spark of excitement igniting in their eyes. This was what they lived for: the thrill of battle, the promise of glory and riches. "Very well," Ragnar replied, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of a leader. "Gather the men. We sail with the tide." As the young warrior hurried back down the path, Bjorn turned to Ragnar. "Another raid, another chance for glory. Are you ready, my friend?" Ragnar's grin was fierce and determined. "With you by my side, Bjorn, I'm ready for anything." The village was a flurry of activity as the Vikings prepared for the impending raid. Weapons were sharpened, shields were mended, and provisions were loaded onto the longships. Ragnar and Bjorn moved through the crowd, offering words of encouragement and last-minute instructions. As the sun reached its zenith, the raiding party gathered at the shore. Ragnar stood before them, his presence commanding and inspiring. "Men of the north," he called out, his voice carrying over the assembled warriors. "Today we sail for glory and riches. Our axes will drink deep, and our names will be sung in the great halls. Are you with me?" A thunderous roar erupted from the crowd, weapons raised high in salute to their leader. Bjorn stood at Ragnar's side, his own weapon held aloft, a proud smile on his face. The journey south was swift, aided by favorable winds and calm seas. As night fell, the target village came into view, its inhabitants unaware of the danger that approached. Ragnar gathered his men for one final address before the attack. "Remember," he said, his voice low but intense, "we strike hard and fast, no unnecessary bloodshed. We take what we need and leave. Bjorn will lead the first wave, and I'll bring up the rear. May the gods favor us this day." The raid was a resounding success. Ragnar and Bjorn's coordination was flawless, their years of fighting side by side evident in every move they made. They anticipated each other's actions, covering weak spots and creating opportunities for their fellow warriors. As dawn broke, the Vikings returned to their ships laden with treasure and slaves. The village behind them smoldered, a testament to their swift and brutal efficiency. As they set sail for home, Ragnar and Bjorn stood at the prow of the lead ship, surveying their victorious fleet. "Another successful raid," Bjorn said, clapping Ragnar on the shoulder. "The Skalds will have much to sing about when we return." Ragnar nodded, his expression a mix of satisfaction and something deeper, a hunger for more. "Indeed, but this is just the beginning, my friend. I have greater plans for our people." Upon their return, the village erupted in celebration. As night fell and the mead flowed freely, word spread through the crowd. The clan elders had made a decision. In the great hall, packed with warriors and villagers alike, the eldest of the clan stood to make the announcement. "Ragnar Lothbrok," the old man's voice rang out, silencing the crowd. "Step forward." Ragnar approached, his heart pounding with anticipation. He could feel Bjorn's supportive presence just behind him. "Your deeds have not gone unnoticed," the elder continued. "Your bravery in battle, your wisdom in leadership, and your vision for our people have proven you worthy. From this day forward, you shall be our chieftain." A deafening cheer erupted from the assembled crowd. Ragnar, momentarily stunned, felt Bjorn's hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "Accept it, my friend," Bjorn whispered. "You were born for this." Ragnar straightened, his voice strong as he addressed the clan. I accept this honor with humility and determination. Together, we will forge a legacy that will echo through the ages. As the celebration continued late into the night, Ragnar and Bjorn found a quiet moment away from the crowds. They stood in the cool night air, cups of mead in hand, the sounds of revelry drifting from the great hall. Chieftain Ragnar, Bjorn said, raising his cup in a toast. It has a good ring to it. Ragnar chuckled, clinking his cup against Bjorn's. It's still hard to believe, but I couldn't have achieved this without you, my friend. You'll stand with me as my right hand, won't you? Always, Bjorn replied without hesitation. Together there's nothing we can't accomplish. As they drank to their future, neither man noticed the old woman watching them from the shadows. Her eyes, clouded with age but sharp with foresight, narrowed as she observed the two friends. She muttered under her breath, words lost to the night wind, a warning unheard and unheeded. The next morning, nursing sore heads but buoyed by excitement, Ragnar and Bjorn met to discuss their plans for the clan's future. We'll need bigger ships, Ragnar said, pacing the room. Faster, able to carry more men and supplies. And we'll need to train more warriors. Bjorn nodded, adding his own thoughts. We should also establish trade routes. Not every village needs to be raided. Some alliances could prove beneficial. As they continued to plan, mapping out a future filled with glory and prosperity, the bond between them seemed unbreakable. Ragnar, the visionary leader, and Bjorn, the loyal right hand, together, they were unstoppable. But fate, as always, had its own plans, and the seeds of betrayal, though yet unseen, had already been sown. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fjord as Bjorn made his way to the secret meeting place. His heart raced, not from exertion but from the weight of what he was about to do. As he approached the clearing, he saw the silhouettes of 3 men waiting for him. "You're late, Bjorn," growled Hakon, the eldest of the rival clan leaders. Bjorn straightened his shoulders, meeting Hakon's gaze without flinching. "I had to ensure I wasn't followed. Ragnar's eyes are everywhere these days." Ulf, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, spat on the ground. "Ragnar this, Ragnar that. When did we start bowing to a man barely out of his youth?" "That's why we're here," Bjorn said, his voice low and measured. "Ragnar's leadership is taking us down a dangerous path. His ambitions will be the ruin of us all." The third man, Eric the Red, leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "And what do you propose, Bjorn? You're his right-hand man, after all. Why should we trust you?" Bjorn took a deep breath, steeling himself for the words he was about to utter. "Because I know Ragnar better than anyone. I know his strengths and, more importantly, his weaknesses. With your support, we can guide the clan back to the old ways, the safe ways." The men exchanged glances, a mixture of suspicion and interest on their faces. Hakon spoke again. "And what of your loyalty to Ragnar? You've been friends since childhood, or so the stories go." A flicker of emotion crossed Bjorn's face, quickly replaced by determination. "My loyalty is to the clan, to our people. Ragnar's vision will lead us to ruin. I cannot stand by and watch that happen." As the meeting continued, late into the night, none of the men noticed the pair of eyes watching from the shadows, belonging to a figure who slipped away silently into the darkness. The next morning, as Ragnar sat in the great hall discussing plans with his advisors, his wife Aslaug approached, her face etched with concern. "My love," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "May I speak with you in private?" Ragnar nodded, excusing himself from the meeting. Once they were alone, Aslaug spoke in hushed tones. "I'm worried about Bjorn. He's been acting strange lately." Ragnar's brow furrowed. "Strange how?" "He's been disappearing at odd hours, speaking in whispers with some of the older warriors. And when he looks at you..." Aslaug hesitated. "There's something in his eyes I don't trust." Ragnar sighed, running a hand through his hair. Bjorn has been under a lot of pressure lately. We all have. I'm sure it's nothing. Aslaug pressed on, her voice urgent. Please, Ragnar. Promise me you'll be careful. Something doesn't feel right. Ragnar took his wife's hands in his voice soft but firm. I appreciate your concern, my love. But Bjorn is like a brother to me. He would never betray my trust. As Aslaug left, her worry unabated, Ragnar couldn't shake the seed of doubt she had planted. He pushed it aside, focusing instead on the challenges that lay ahead. The winter that followed was one of the harshest in living memory. Thick ice choked the fjords, making fishing nearly impossible. Game became scarce, and the stored provisions dwindled rapidly. Ragnar found himself facing the greatest test of his leadership yet. In the Great Hall, tensions ran high as Ragnar addressed the clan. We must ration our remaining food carefully, he declared. Every able-bodied person will take turns hunting and fishing, no matter how difficult the conditions. A murmur of discontent rippled through the crowd. Bjorn stepped forward, his voice carrying across the hall. Perhaps, Ragnar, it would be wiser to send out raiding parties. There are settlements to the south that would be easy targets even in this weather. Ragnar shook his head. No, Bjorn. We cannot risk losing men to the treacherous seas or unknown territories. We must endure this winter together, here in our home. As the weeks wore on and hardships mounted, Bjorn's words began to take root among the clan members. In hushed conversations around hearthfires, people began to question Ragnar's decisions. If we had raided as Bjorn suggested, we wouldn't be going hungry now, one warrior grumbled. Aye, another agreed. Ragnar's grown soft. He's forgotten the old ways. Bjorn, ever present, would nod sympathetically, adding fuel to the fire of discontent with carefully chosen words. Ragnar means well, but perhaps he's not as suited to leadership as we thought. Despite the challenges, Ragnar worked tirelessly to see his people through the winter. He organized hunting parties, developed new fishing techniques to break through the ice, and even rationed his own family's food to ensure the weakest members of the clan were cared for. As the first signs of spring began to appear, the mood in the village lightened. They had survived the brutal winter, but the experience had left its mark. The once unshakable faith in Ragnar's leadership had been tested, and for some found wanting. It was on a brisk morning, as the ice began to break up in the fjord, that a foreign trader's ship made its way into the harbor. The clan gathered eagerly, hungry for news from the outside world and the promise of fresh supplies. The trader, a weathered man named Halvard, was welcomed into the Great Hall. As he shared his wares and news, one piece of information caught everyone's attention. There's a kingdom to the west, Halvard said, his eyes glinting with excitement. Rich beyond imagination. Gold, silver, lands ripe for the taking. They say their defenses are weak, their warriors soft from years of peace. The hall erupted in excited chatter. Ragnar leaned forward, his interest piqued. Tell me more about this kingdom, Halvard. As the trader spun tales of the wealthy land across the sea, Bjorn watched Ragnar carefully. He could see the fire of ambition igniting in his friend's eyes, and knew that this could be the opportunity he had been waiting for. Later that night, as the village buzzed with excitement over the trader's news, Bjorn met again with the rival clan leaders. This is our chance, he said, his voice low and urgent. Ragnar will not be able to resist the lure of this new kingdom. He'll mount a massive expedition, leaving our lands vulnerable. Håkon nodded slowly. And when he fails? A grim smile played on Bjorn's lips. When he fails, the clan will see him for the reckless leader he is. They'll be ready for a change, and we'll be there to provide it. As the men continued to plot, the winds of change began to blow through the Viking lands. The harsh winter had tested them all, and the promise of a wealthy new conquest loomed on the horizon. But beneath the surface, the currents of betrayal ran deep, threatening to upend everything Ragnar had built. In the coming days, as Ragnar began to formulate plans for the greatest expedition their clan had ever undertaken, he remained unaware of the storm brewing within his own ranks. The bond he shared with Bjorn, once thought unbreakable, was straining under the weight of ambition and resentment. As the chapter of discontent drew to a close, the stage was set for a journey that would change the fate of the clan forever. The whispers of dissent had taken root, and only time would tell if Ragnar's leadership could withstand the trials that lay ahead. The great hall buzzed with anticipation as Ragnar stood before his clan, his eyes alight with the fire of ambition. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and excitement as he raised his hands for silence. "My fellow warriors," Ragnar's voice boomed across the hall. "The gods have blessed us with an opportunity for glory and riches beyond our wildest dreams." He paused, letting the tension build. "To the west lies a kingdom of untold wealth, ripe for the taking. I say we seize this chance and carve our names into the annals of history." A roar of approval erupted from the assembled Vikings. Weapons clashed against shields in a thunderous show of support. Ragnar's gaze swept across the crowd, noting the eager faces of young warriors and the cautious nods of the elders. "We will mount the largest expedition our clan has ever seen," he continued. "Every able-bodied warrior will join us. We'll build more ships, forge more weapons, and when we return, our village will never know hardship again." As the cheers died down, Bjorn stepped forward, his face a mask of support and enthusiasm. "A bold plan, Ragnar," he said, his voice carrying across the now quieted hall. "But perhaps we should consider a more strategic approach?" Ragnar turned to his friend, curiosity evident in his expression. "What do you suggest, Bjorn?" Bjorn's eyes glinted as he addressed both Ragnar and the crowd. "Why risk everything on a single assault? I propose we split our forces. One group can attack from the north, drawing their defenses, while the other strikes from the south, catching them unawares." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Ragnar frowned, considering the suggestion. "Dividing our strength could be dangerous, Bjorn. We know little of this kingdom's true power." "True," Bjorn conceded, "but think of the advantage it would give us. They'd never expect an attack from two fronts. It's a risk, yes, but one that could lead to even greater victory." Ragnar stood silent for a moment, weighing the proposal. The clan watched, breath held as their leader deliberated. Finally, Ragnar nodded slowly. "Your counsel is wise, as always, my friend. We'll split our forces. Bjorn, you'll lead the northern assault. I'll take the southern approach." The decision made, the clan erupted into a flurry of activity. For weeks, the village was a hive of preparation. New ships were constructed, weapons forged, and provisions gathered. The air rang with the sound of hammers on wood and the sharpening of blades. On the eve of their departure, Ragnar stood at the edge of the fjord, watching the last rays of sunlight dance across the water. Aslaug approached, her face etched with worry. "Must you go through with this, my love?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ragnar turned to her, his eyes soft but determined. "This is our chance, Aslaug, to secure a future for our people, for our children." She placed a hand on his cheek, her touch gentle. "Just promise me you'll return." He leaned into her touch, his voice low and fierce. "Wild horses couldn't keep me from coming back to you." As dawn broke the next day, the Viking fleet set sail, a formidable sight of dragon-headed ships stretching across the horizon. Ragnar stood at the prow of his ship, Bjorn at his side. "May the gods favor us, my friend," Ragnar said, clasping Bjorn's shoulder. Bjorn nodded, his face unreadable. "May they indeed." The two fleets separated, Bjorn's heading north while Ragnar's turned south. For days they sailed through calm seas, the wind at their backs as if the gods themselves blessed their journey. But as they entered unfamiliar waters, their luck changed. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and soon, Ragnar's fleet found itself in the midst of a ferocious storm. Waves as tall as mountains threatened to swallow the ships whole. Rain lashed at the faces of the crew as they fought to keep their vessels afloat. "Hold fast!" Ragnar shouted over the howling wind. "We are Vikings! No mere storm will defeat us." For 3 days and nights they battled the tempest. When at last the skies cleared, they found their numbers diminished. Several ships lost to the hungry sea. But their trials were not over. As they approached the coastline of the foreign kingdom, strange ships appeared on the horizon. Their sails bore unfamiliar markings, and their intent was clearly hostile. "Pirates!" The cry went up from the lookout. Ragnar's eyes narrowed. "They've picked the wrong fleet to prey upon. Man the oars. Prepare for battle." The clash was swift and brutal. The pirates, expecting easy prey, found themselves outmatched by the battle-hardened Vikings. Ragnar led the charge, his axe rising and falling in a deadly arc. When the last pirate ship slipped beneath the waves, the Vikings raised a cheer of victory. Battered but unbroken, Ragnar's fleet finally approached the shores of the foreign kingdom. As they prepared to make landfall, Ragnar scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of Bjorn's ships. "Any sight of the northern fleet?" he asked his second-in-command. The man shook his head. "None, my lord. Perhaps they were delayed by the storm as well?" Ragnar frowned, a sense of unease settling in his gut. "Perhaps. We'll make camp on the beach and wait for word." As the Vikings established their beachhead, tension filled the air. Warriors sharpened their weapons and donned their armor, preparing for the battle to come. Ragnar paced the shoreline, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of Bjorn's ships. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sand, a lone figure approached the camp. The Vikings tensed, weapons at the ready, but Ragnar waved them down as he recognized the man as one of Bjorn's scouts. "My lord," the scout said, breathless from his journey, "I bring a message from Bjorn." Ragnar's heart quickened. "Speak, then. Where is the northern fleet?" The scout hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. "Bjorn says, he says to proceed with the attack. He'll join you when the time is right." Ragnar's brow furrowed. "That's all? No explanation for their absence?" The scout shook his head. "No, my lord. Just that you should trust in Bjorn's plan." As the scout retreated, Ragnar stood alone on the beach, the cryptic message turning over in his mind. Something felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on what. The bond of trust between him and Bjorn, forged over a lifetime, warred with the growing sense of unease in his gut. Finally, Ragnar turned back to his men, his decision made. "We attack at dawn," he announced. "Bjorn and the Northern Fleet will join us in due time. For now, we fight for glory, for riches, and for our place in history." A cheer went up from the assembled warriors, but as Ragnar retreated to his tent to finalize battle plans, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. As he unrolled maps and positioned markers representing their forces, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Outside, the night grew deep, and the foreign shore lay silent, unaware of the Viking threat that lurked on its beaches. In the darkness, Ragnar's warriors prepared for battle, their hearts filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky, Ragnar emerged from his tent, fully armored and ready for battle. He cast one last look at the empty horizon, hoping against hope to see Bjorn's ships appearing. But the sea remained empty, and with a heavy heart, Ragnar raised his axe, signaling the start of the attack. The morning sun rose over a landscape soon to be bathed in blood. Ragnar's Viking horde surged forward, their battle cries echoing across the fields as they charged towards the kingdom's walls. The defenders, caught off guard but quick to respond, poured out to meet the invaders. Steel clashed against steel, the air filled with the sounds of combat and the cries of the wounded. Ragnar led from the front, his axe a whirlwind of destruction, cutting down foes with each swing. "For glory!" Ragnar roared, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "For our people!" His warriors responded with renewed vigor, pushing the kingdom's forces back. The battle raged on, neither side willing to give ground. Ragnar found himself in the thick of the fighting, his armor splattered with blood, both his own and his enemies'. As the sun reached its zenith, the tide of battle seemed to be turning in the Vikings' favor. The defenders were faltering, their lines beginning to break under the relentless Norse assault. Ragnar allowed himself a moment of hope, thinking that victory might be within their grasp even without Bjorn's support. But fate had other plans. From the north, a horn blasted, its deep tone carrying across the battlefield. Ragnar's heart leapt. Bjorn had arrived at last. He turned, expecting to see his friend's forces joining the fray against their common enemy. What he saw instead froze the blood in his veins. Bjorn's army poured onto the battlefield, their weapons raised high. But they weren't charging the kingdom's defenders. Instead, they fell upon Ragnar's men from behind, cutting down the unsuspecting Vikings with ruthless efficiency. "What madness is this?" Ragnar bellowed, his mind reeling from the incomprehensible sight before him. Confusion rippled through Ragnar's forces. Warriors who had been pressing their advantage moments before now found themselves caught between two enemies, unsure of where to turn or who to fight. "Bjorn!" Ragnar roared, his voice carrying over the chaos. "What are you doing?" But Bjorn, if he heard, gave no response. His forces continued their brutal assault, cutting down Ragnar's men without mercy. Ragnar fought like a man possessed, trying to reach his friend, to understand what was happening. He cut a swath through friend and foe alike, his mind focused on a single goal, confronting Bjorn. As he battled his way across the field, Ragnar caught glimpses of the carnage unfolding around him. Men he had known since childhood fell to Bjorn's treacherous attack. The kingdom's defenders, seeing their chance, renewed their assault with vigor. "Rally to me," Ragnar called out to his remaining loyal warriors. "Form ranks, defend yourselves." A group of his most trusted men managed to fight their way to his side, forming a protective circle around their leader. Together, they pushed through the melee, inching closer to where Bjorn directed his forces. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of bloodshed, Ragnar broke through the last line of combatants separating him from Bjorn. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and Ragnar saw something in his old friend's gaze that he had never seen before: cold, calculating ambition. "Bjorn," Ragnar shouted, his voice hoarse from battle, "why have you done this? We were brothers." Bjorn's face twisted into a sneer. "Brothers? You were always the golden child, Ragnar, the chosen one. It was time someone showed everyone your true worth." "This is madness," Ragnar pleaded, still unable to fully comprehend the betrayal. "Think of our people, of everything we've built together." "I am thinking of our people," Bjorn spat back. "You would have led us to ruin with your grand ambitions. It's time for a new leader, one who understands the old ways." As they argued, the battle raged on around them. Vikings fought Vikings, while the kingdom's defenders took advantage of the chaos to press their attack. The field was a swirling maelstrom of violence and betrayal. Ragnar, his heart heavy but his resolve firm, raised his axe. "Then let the gods decide, old friend. Face me, if you dare." Bjorn's eyes narrowed, and he hefted his own weapon. "With pleasure." The two men, once as close as brothers, now circled each other like wolves. Their weapons clashed, the sound ringing out above the din of battle. They were evenly matched, each knowing the other's fighting style intimately from years of training together. As they fought, Ragnar tried one last time to reach his friend. "It doesn't have to be this way, Bjorn. We can still fix this." But Bjorn's face remained a mask of determination and resentment. "It's too late for that, Ragnar. Only one of us will leave this field alive." Their duel continued, neither able to gain the upper hand. Around them, the battle began to turn. Ragnar's loyal warriors, though outnumbered, fought with the desperation of men betrayed. The kingdom's defenders, seeing their chance, pressed their advantage. In a moment of distraction, Ragnar's eyes flicked to the side, checking on his men. It was all the opening Bjorn needed. With a swift, brutal movement, he stepped in close and drove his sword into Ragnar's back, finding a weak spot in his armor. Ragnar's eyes widened in shock and pain. He staggered, his axe slipping from suddenly numb fingers. "Bjorn," he gasped, disbelief written across his face. Bjorn leaned in close, his voice a harsh whisper. Long live the new chief. But Ragnar, even gravely wounded, was not finished. With the last of his strength, he reached for the knife at his belt. As Bjorn stepped back, a triumphant grin on his face, Ragnar surged forward. The knife found its mark, sliding between Bjorn's ribs and piercing his heart. Bjorn's eyes widened in shock, mirroring Ragnar's own expression from moments before. "We go to Valhalla together, old friend," Ragnar managed to say, his voice weak but determined. The two men, once inseparable allies and now mortal enemies, collapsed to the blood-soaked ground. Around them, the battle continued to rage, but for Ragnar and Bjorn, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. "Why?" Ragnar asked, his life ebbing away. "We could have had everything." Bjorn, his own breath coming in ragged gasps, managed a bitter laugh. "You already had everything, Ragnar. I just wanted my share." As the light began to fade from their eyes, the full weight of their tragedy settled over them. A friendship forged in childhood, tempered by countless battles, now ended in betrayal and death. With their leaders fallen, both armies seemed to lose their will to fight. The kingdom's defenders, seizing their chance, pressed forward, driving the disorganized Vikings back towards the shore. As Ragnar's consciousness faded, his last thoughts were of his people, his family, and the friend he had lost. The great expedition, born of ambition and dreams of glory, had ended in betrayal and defeat. The sun began to set on the blood-soaked battlefield, casting long shadows over the fallen. Among the dead lay two men, once the closest of friends, now united only in death. The consequences of their actions would ripple out, changing the fate of their clan and the kingdom they had sought to conquer. As darkness fell, the sounds of battle faded, replaced by the cries of the wounded and the lamentations of the survivors. The great betrayal had been unveiled, but its full impact was yet to be felt by those left behind, to pick up the pieces of a shattered dream. The battlefield fell silent as word spread of the fateful duel between Ragnar and Bjorn. Warriors on both sides lowered their weapons, drawn to the scene of their fallen leaders. The two men, once inseparable friends and now mortal enemies, lay side by side in the blood-soaked earth, their life ebbing away with each labored breath. Ragnar, his face pale and drawn with pain, turned his head to look at Bjorn. "Why, old friend?" he gasped, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "Tell me the truth before we meet the gods." Bjorn, his own life fading fast, let out a bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "The truth, Ragnar. The truth is that I've lived in your shadow for too long. Always the loyal friend, never the leader. Do you know what that's like?" "We were brothers in all but blood," Ragnar whispered, his voice filled with confusion and hurt. "I would have given you anything you asked for. Anything but the one thing I truly wanted," Bjorn spat. "Leadership, respect, the chance to forge my own legacy instead of being a footnote in yours." As the two dying men spoke, their warriors gathered around, listening in stunned silence to the revelation of Bjorn's long-harbored jealousy. "I never meant to overshadow you," Ragnar said, his voice growing weaker. "We could have ruled together, built something greater than either of us could alone." Bjorn's eyes, once filled with resentment, now showed a glimmer of regret. Perhaps you're right. But it's too late now, isn't it? We've destroyed everything we built." As their leaders lay dying, the reality of the situation began to sink in for the Viking warriors. Rage, born of betrayal and loss, began to build among Ragnar's loyal followers. Gunnar, one of Ragnar's most trusted lieutenants, raised his blood-stained axe high. "Brothers," he roared, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "Will we let this treachery stand? Will we let Ragnar's death go unavenged?" A roar of anger answered him. Ragnar's men, their spirits rekindled by righteous fury, turned as one to face Bjorn's forces. The battlefield erupted once more into chaos as Viking fought Viking, brother against brother. The kingdom's army, seeing the invaders turn on each other, began to pull back. Their commander, a grizzled veteran named Aldrich, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "By the gods," he muttered to his second in command. "I've never seen anything like this in all my years of warfare." "Should we press the attack, sir?" the younger officer asked. "They're distracted, vulnerable." Aldrich shook his head slowly. "No, let them destroy each other. We'll defend the walls if any survive to threaten us again. For now, tend to our wounded and strengthen our defenses." As the kingdom's forces retreated, the Vikings' internal conflict raged on. The battlefield became a swirling melee of former comrades locked in mortal combat. Cries of anger, pain, and betrayal filled the air as men who had once fought side by side now sought each other's blood. In the midst of the chaos, Ragnar summoned the last of his strength. Despite the grave wound in his back, he pushed himself up on one elbow, his voice weak but commanding. "Stop!" he cried out, his words barely audible above the din of battle. "Stop this madness!" A few nearby warriors heard him and paused, turning to look at their dying leader. Ragnar's voice grew stronger as he continued, fueled by desperation and the knowledge that these might be his final words. "We are Vikings," he shouted, blood staining his beard. "We do not fall to treachery or turn on our own. Remember who you are, who we are." His words, carried across the battlefield by those who heard them, began to take effect. Slowly, the fighting began to subside as more and more warriors lowered their weapons, looking to their fallen leader. "Bjorn's betrayal is his shame alone," Ragnar continued, his voice growing weaker with each word. "Do not let it destroy everything we have built. Unite, unite, and live to fight another day." As Ragnar spoke, Bjorn watched him with a mixture of awe and regret. In his final moments, he saw once again the leadership quality that had always set Ragnar apart. "He's right," Bjorn said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong, so terribly wrong." Ragnar turned to look at his old friend one last time. "We both were in our own ways," he said softly. "May the gods forgive us." With those words, Ragnar's strength finally gave out. He collapsed back to the ground, his eyes fixed on the sky above. Beside him, Bjorn too drew his final breath, the weight of his actions heavy upon him even in death. As their leaders fell silent, a hush descended over the battlefield. Vikings on both sides looked at each other, then at the fallen forms of Ragnar and Bjorn. The madness of battle faded, replaced by a somber realization of what had been lost. Gunnar, his voice thick with emotion, raised his axe once more. But this time, it was not in anger. "Ragnar Lothbrok," he cried out, "the greatest leader we have ever known. Ragnar Lothbrok." The cry was taken up by others, spreading across the battlefield. Even some of Bjorn's men joined in, recognizing the tragedy of what had transpired. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked field, the Vikings began to gather their dead and wounded. The battle was over, but the cost had been catastrophic. Two great leaders had fallen, and with them, the dreams of glory and conquest that had driven them to these foreign shores. Aldrich, the kingdom's commander, watched from the walls as the Vikings prepared to depart. "Will they be back, do you think?" his young officer asked. The old warrior shook his head slowly. "Not for a long time, I'd wager. They have their own battles to fight now, battles of the spirit rather than the sword." As night fell, the Viking longships pushed off from the shore, carrying with them the bodies of Ragnar and Bjorn. The great expedition, born of ambition and sundered by betrayal, had come to its bitter end. Back in the Viking homeland, word would soon spread of the tragedy that had unfolded on distant shores. The tale of Ragnar and Bjorn, of friendship turned to bitter rivalry, would be told around fires for generations to come. It would serve as a warning of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of loyalty and trust. And so, as the ships disappeared into the darkness, the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok and the great betrayal began to take shape. The fall of giants had shaken the very foundations of the Viking world, leaving those who remained to pick up the pieces and forge a new path forward in a world forever changed by the events of that fateful day. The longships cut through the choppy waters, their dragon heads bowed as if in mourning. On board, the surviving Vikings sat in somber silence, their eyes fixed on the horizons of their homeland. The bodies of Ragnar and Bjorn lay side by side, covered in rich furs, one honored as a fallen hero, the other as a cautionary tale of betrayal. As the fjords came into view, Gunnar, now the de facto leader, stood at the prow of the lead ship. His weathered face was etched with grief and exhaustion. "Land ho!" he called out, his voice lacking its usual vigor. The warriors stirred, a mixture of relief and dread washing over them. How could they face their families, their clan, with such a tale of tragedy and betrayal? As they docked, a crowd had already gathered on the shore. Word of their return had spread quickly. Faces eager for news of victory quickly turned to shock and sorrow as they saw the bodies being carried off the ships. "Ragnar, no!" A heart-wrenching cry cut through the air. Aslaug, Ragnar's wife, pushed through the crowd, her face a mask of anguish. She fell to her knees beside her husband's body, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Gunnar approached her cautiously. "My lady," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "Ragnar fell in battle, but not by the hand of our enemies. It was Bjorn," Aslaug finished, her voice suddenly cold. She looked up, her eyes blazing with a mixture of grief and fury. "I knew. I saw it in a vision." A murmur ran through the crowd. Aslaug's prophetic abilities were well known but rarely spoken of openly. "There's more," she continued, rising to her feet. "While you were gone, the rival clans attacked our villages. They knew our defenses would be weak." Shocked gasps and angry curses erupted from the gathered Vikings. Gunnar's face darkened with rage. "Bjorn's treachery runs deeper than we thought," he growled. As the warriors and villagers alike processed this news, a commotion arose near Bjorn's body. Two young warriors were rifling through his belongings, their faces twisted with disgust. "Stop that!" Gunnar barked, moving to intervene. "Wait," one of the young men called out. "We found something." He held up a rolled parchment sealed with wax. Breaking it open, his eyes widened as he scanned its contents. It's a pact," he stammered. "Between Bjorn and the rival clan leaders. They planned this all along." The document was passed to Gunnar, who read it aloud for all to hear. It detailed a secret agreement. Bjorn would lead Ragnar to his doom, and in return the rival clans would support his claim as the new leader. A heavy silence fell over the gathering as the full extent of the betrayal sank in. Then, like a dam bursting, voices erupted in anger and disbelief. "We should have seen it. How could he do this to us? What do we do now?" Gunnar raised his hands for silence. "We must decide our next move carefully," he said. "Our home is under threat, but the kingdom we set out to raid is still ripe for the taking. What say you? Do we return to defend our lands, or do we press on with Ragnar's vision?" The debate that followed was heated. Some argued for immediate revenge against the rival clans, while others insisted that they should complete the raid, returning with riches to strengthen their defenses. As the arguments grew more intense, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "I say we do both." The Vikings turned as one to see a young man pushing his way forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with Ragnar's piercing blue eyes. "Who are you to make such a claim?" Gunnar demanded. The young man stood tall, meeting Gunnar's gaze unflinchingly. "My name is Ivar," he announced. "I am Ragnar's son." A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Aslaug's eyes widened in recognition, but she remained silent. "Lies!" someone shouted. "Ragnar had no other sons!" Ivar turned to face the crowd, his voice ringing with conviction. "I am his son, born of a liaison before he married Aslaug. He never acknowledged me publicly, but he trained me in secret, preparing me for a day he hoped would never come." He turned back to Gunnar. "I have my father's strategic mind and his warrior spirit. I can lead a force back to raid the kingdom while you defend our lands. When we return with our spoils, we'll crush the rival clans once and for all." The gathered Vikings looked at each other uncertainly. Could they trust this stranger who claimed to be Ragnar's son? Aslaug stepped forward, her face a mixture of emotions. "It's true," she said softly. "Ragnar told me of Ivar long ago. He wanted to acknowledge him, but feared it would cause strife within the clan." Gunnar studied Ivar intently, seeing the echo of Ragnar in his stance and gaze. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "If Aslaug confirms your identity, then we will hear your plan. But know this, if you betray us as Bjorn did, your fate will be far worse than his." Ivar nodded grimly. "I understand. I loved my father, even from afar. I would sooner die than dishonor his memory." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fjord, the Vikings gathered around Ivar and Gunnar. Plans were made, strategies discussed, and a new path forward began to take shape. The bodies of Ragnar and Bjorn were prepared for their final journey. Ragnar would be sent to Valhalla with all the honors befitting a great leader. Bjorn, despite his betrayal, would be given a warrior's funeral, his final fate left to the gods to decide. As night fell, Aslaug stood alone by the water's edge, watching the funeral pyres burn on their floating platforms. She thought of Ragnar, of the life they had shared, and of the uncertain future that lay ahead. "You always said fate was against you," she whispered to the flames. "But even in death, you find a way to shape our destiny. Watch over us, my love. Watch over your son. Guide him as he leads our people through the storms to come." With a heavy heart but a glimmer of hope, Aslaug turned back to the village. The Vikings had suffered a great loss, but they were not defeated. In the crucible of betrayal and tragedy, a new leader had emerged. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok had ended, but the legend of Ivar was just beginning. As the funeral pyres drifted out to sea, carrying the remains of two men who had once been as close as brothers, the Vikings prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. The world had changed, alliances had shifted, and the future was uncertain. But they were Vikings, and they would face whatever came with courage, strength, and the indomitable spirit that had always defined their people. The tale of Ragnar's fall and Ivar's rise would be told for generations to come, a reminder of the complex bonds of loyalty, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the enduring power of a leader's legacy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Viking encampment as Ivar stood before the assembled clan. The air was thick with tension and uncertainty, the recent events weighing heavily on everyone's minds. Gunnar, the seasoned warrior who had temporarily taken charge, stepped forward to address the crowd. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "we have suffered a great loss. Ragnar, our leader, our inspiration, is gone, but his blood lives on." He gestured towards Ivar. "This young man claims to be Ragnar's son. Aslaug has confirmed his identity. The question before us now is, do we accept him as our new leader?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement while others looked skeptical. An older warrior, his beard streaked with gray, spoke up. "How do we know he has Ragnar's wisdom, his courage? Leading a raid is one thing, but leading a clan is another matter entirely." Ivar stepped forward, his blue eyes, so like Ragnar's, scanning the faces before him. "I understand your doubts," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I haven't fought beside you, haven't shared in your triumphs and losses. But I carry my father's blood, and more importantly, his teachings. He prepared me for this day, though neither of us hoped it would come so soon." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I don't ask for your blind loyalty. I ask for a chance to prove myself worthy of leading you, to honor my father's memory, and to lead our people to the greatness he envisioned." There was a moment of silence. Then Gunnar spoke again. "Those in favor of accepting Ivar as our new leader, raise your axes." Slowly, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, axes were raised throughout the crowd. Not all, but enough. Gunnar nodded solemnly. It is decided. Ivar, son of Ragnar, will lead us home. As the clan began to prepare for the journey, Ivar approached Gunnar. Thank you for your support, he said quietly. Gunnar's face was grim. Don't thank me yet, boy. Leading these warriors won't be easy. One mistake, and they'll turn on you faster than you can blink. Prove yourself worthy of Ragnar's legacy. Ivar nodded, determination etched on his face. I will, for my father, and for our people. The journey home began under a cloud of uncertainty. The longships cut through the waves, their dragon heads facing towards the homeland they had left what felt like a lifetime ago. But it wasn't long before the first challenge presented itself. On the third day of their voyage, a lookout spotted sails on the horizon. Ships approaching from the west, he called out. They fly no friendly colors. Ivar climbed to the bow of the lead ship, studying the approaching vessels with narrowed eyes. Pursuers, he muttered. Perhaps word of our failed raid has spread. Gunnar joined him, his hand on the hilt of his sword. We're outnumbered, he observed grimly, and our warriors are weary from battle and grief. What do you propose, young leader? Ivar's mind raced, recalling the lessons his father had taught him in secret. We can't outrun them, he said slowly, and a direct confrontation would be costly. We need to outsmart them. He turned to the crew. Lower the sails, and bring me every empty barrel and cask we have on board. The Vikings scrambled to obey, though many exchanged confused glances. Gunnar raised an eyebrow. What's your plan? Ivar grinned, a flash of Ragnar's cunning gleaming in his eyes. We're going to disappear. Under Ivar's direction, the Vikings lashed the empty barrels together, creating crude rafts. As the pursuing ships drew closer, Ivar gave the order. Into the water, cling to the rafts and stay low. The clan obeyed, slipping into the cold sea and huddling around the makeshift rafts. Ivar was the last to leave the ship, pausing only to set a small, smoky fire in the hold. From the water, they watched as their ships, seemingly abandoned in one trailing smoke, drifted aimlessly. The pursuing vessels approached cautiously. Pirates, one of the Vikings hissed. They think we've abandoned ship. Ivar nodded. And so they will. Watch. Sure enough, the pirate ships pulled alongside the Viking vessels. They could hear shouts of confusion and disappointment as the pirates found the ships empty save for a small harmless fire. They'll search the ships, find nothing of value, and leave, Ivar explained quietly. And we'll have saved our strength for the battles that truly matter. As Ivar had predicted, the pirates soon gave up their search and sailed away, leaving the Viking ships unmolested. Once the horizon was clear, the clan climbed back aboard, many looking at their young leader with newfound respect. Gunnar clapped Ivar on the shoulder. A clever trick, he admitted. Ragnar would have been proud. The journey continued, with Ivar proving his worth time and again. He navigated treacherous waters, mediated disputes among the crew, and kept spirits high with tales of the glory that awaited them. But as they neared their homeland, a terrible sight greeted them. Smoke rose from the direction of their village, and the sounds of battle carried across the water. No, Gunnar breathed. The rival clans. They've attacked while we were away. Ivar's face hardened. Then they'll regret their decision. All warriors prepare for battle. We fight for our homes, our families, and for Ragnar's memory. A roar went up from the Vikings as they readied their weapons. The ships surged forward, driven by renewed determination. As they approached the shore, they could see their kinsmen fighting desperately against the invading forces. The rival clans, thinking the majority of the warriors were away on the raid, had launched an all-out assault. Ivar stood at the prow of the lead ship, his father's axe in his hand. For Ragnar, he bellowed. For our people. For Ragnar, the Vikings roared in response. The ships crashed onto the beach and the warriors poured out, charging into the fray with a ferocity born of rage and desperation. Ivar led from the front, his axe a whirlwind of destruction as he cut a path through the enemy ranks. The tide of battle quickly turned. The rival clans, caught between the defenders of the village and the returning warriors, began to falter. Ivar fought his way to where Aslaug was directing the defense, a shield in one hand and a bloodied sword in the other. "Mother," he called out, "we've returned." Aslaug's eyes widened in relief and pride. "My son," she said, "you've come home." Together they rallied the defenders for one final push. The rival clans, realizing their plan had backfired spectacularly, began to retreat. But Ivar was not content to let them escape. "Pursue them," he ordered. "Let them know the price of attacking our home." As the sun began to set, the last of the invaders were driven from the village. The Vikings, bloodied but victorious, let out a cheer that echoed across the fjord. Ivar stood before them, his father's axe raised high. "Today, we have proven that the spirit of Ragnar lives on in all of us," he declared. "We have faced betrayal, loss, and invasion, but we stand unbroken. But we stand. Let all who would threaten our people know that we are Vikings and we will never surrender." The clan roared their approval, any lingering doubts about their young leader washed away by the tide of victory. As night fell, the Vikings began to tend to their wounded and honor their fallen. But there was a new energy in the air, a sense of purpose and unity that had been missing since Ragnar's death. Gunnar approached Ivar as the young leader helped with the wounded. "You've proven yourself today," the old warrior said gruffly. "Ragnar would be proud." Ivar nodded solemnly. "This is only the beginning," he said. "We have enemies to defeat, lands to conquer, and my father's legacy to uphold. The saga of our people is far from over." As the fires burned low and the stars came out over the fjord, the Vikings looked to their new leader with hope and determination. The rise of Ivar, son of Ragnar, marked the beginning of a new chapter in their history. The challenges ahead were many, but with the blood of Ragnar flowing through their veins and the wisdom of their ancestors guiding them, they knew that their greatest adventures were yet to come. The dawn broke over the Viking village, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. The air was thick with tension as Ivar, son of Ragnar, stood atop a small hill overlooking the fjord. Below, the invading forces of the rival clans had regrouped, their numbers swelled by reinforcements that had arrived during the night. Gunnar approached, his weathered face grim. "They outnumber us 3-1, he reported. "Many of our warriors are still exhausted from the journey and yesterday's skirmish." Ivar nodded, his eyes never leaving the enemy lines. "Numbers aren't everything," he said, a hint of his father's confidence in his voice. "We have the advantage of familiar terrain and the strength of desperation. This is our home, and we will defend it to the last drop of blood." He turned to face the gathered Viking warriors, their faces a mixture of determination and fear. Raising his voice, Ivar addressed them. "Brothers and sisters, today we fight not just for our lives but for our very way of life. The rival clans thought us weak, thought to take advantage of our absence. Let us show them the error of their ways." A cheer went up from the Vikings, their spirits bolstered by their young leader's words. Ivar continued, his voice carrying across the assembled warriors. "Remember the teachings of Ragnar. We are Vikings, descendants of gods and giants. Our enemies may have numbers, but we have the fury of the storm in our veins." As Ivar spoke, the rival clans began to advance. The clash of steel on steel filled the air as the two forces met in a furious battle. Ivar led from the front, his father's axe a whirlwind of destruction as he cut through the enemy ranks. "For Ragnar!" he roared, his battle cry taken up by the Vikings around him. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Vikings fought with the desperation of those defending their homes, while the rival clans pressed their numerical advantage. Blood soaked the earth as warriors fell on both sides. In the midst of the chaos, Ivar's tactical mind, honed by years of secret training from Ragnar, began to shine. He spotted weaknesses in the enemy formation and exploited them ruthlessly. "Gunnar," he called out, "take a group and flank them from the east. Use the cover of the forest." The old warrior nodded, gathering a band of fighters and disappearing into the trees. Moments later, cries of surprise and pain erupted from the enemy's left flank as Gunnar's group struck. Ivar pressed the advantage, driving a wedge into the heart of the rival clan's formation. For a moment, it seemed as though the tide of battle was turning in the Vikings' favor. But fate had other plans. A horn blast echoed across the battlefield, freezing both sides in momentary confusion. From the south, a new army appeared on the horizon. The glint of foreign armor and unfamiliar banners told a chilling tale. The kingdom they had failed to raid had followed them home. By the gods, Gunnar breathed, fighting his way back to Ivar's side. We're trapped between two enemies. Ivar's mind raced, assessing the new threat. To his surprise, the foreign army didn't immediately attack. Instead, their leader rode forward under a flag of truce. "I am Lord Ethelred," the man announced in heavily accented Norse. "We have come seeking the one called Ragnar Lothbrok." Ivar stepped forward, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet battlefield. "Ragnar Lothbrok is dead. I am his son, Ivar." Ethelred's eyes narrowed. "We followed your fleet, seeking vengeance for your attempted raid, but it seems we've stumbled upon a more interesting situation." The leader of the rival clans, a hulking man named Sturkar, spat on the ground. "This is none of your concern, foreigner. Leave now, or join these dogs in death." Ethelred's lip curled in disdain. "I think not. We came for a battle, and a battle we shall have. But perhaps we might choose a side." Ivar's eyes widened as he realized the opportunity before him. He stepped forward, addressing both Ethelred and Sturkar. "Let us settle this in the old way," he proclaimed. "Single combat. The victor's side wins the day." Sturkar laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You? A boy barely old enough to grow a beard? I'll crush you like an insect." Ivar stood tall, channeling every ounce of his father's presence. "I am Ivar, son of Ragnar Lothbrok. My father's blood runs in my veins, and his strength guides my arm. Face me if you dare." A murmur ran through both armies. Ethelred, intrigued by the young leader's boldness, nodded his assent. "We will honor this challenge. Should the boy win, we will aid his people in driving out the invaders." Sturkar, unable to back down without losing face, grudgingly agreed. The two armies formed a ring, creating an impromptu arena for the duel. As Ivar prepared himself, Gunnar approached. "Are you sure about this, lad? Sturkar is a fearsome warrior." Ivar nodded, his face set with determination. "I have to be sure. For our people. For my father's memory." The duel began, and immediately it was clear that Sturkar's strength and experience were formidable. His massive warhammer crashed down, narrowly missing Ivar as the young leader danced aside. "Stand still and die, whelp," Sturkar roared, pressing his attack. Ivar, remembering his father's lessons, kept his cool. He used his smaller size and greater agility to avoid Sturkar's crushing blows, waiting for an opening. The battle raged on, with neither combatant able to land a decisive blow. Sturkar's frustration grew, his attacks becoming wilder and less controlled. Seizing his chance, Ivar feinted left, then ducked under Sturkar's guard. His axe bit deep into the larger man's side, drawing first blood. Enraged, Sturkar redoubled his assault. But now Ivar had found his rhythm, weaving in and out of the big man's reach, landing stinging blows that slowly sapped Sturkar's strength. As the duel entered its final desperate phase, Ivar saw his opening. Sturkar, overextended from a mighty swing, left himself exposed for just a moment. It was all Ivar needed. With a roar that would have made Ragnar proud, Ivar brought his axe down in a devastating arc. The blade struck true, cleaving through Sturkar's shoulder and into his chest. The rival clan leader fell to his knees, shock and disbelief etched on his face. With his last breath, he looked up at Ivar. "How?" Ivar stood over his fallen opponent, his voice low but carrying to all assembled. "I am my father's son." A great cheer went up from the Vikings as Styrkar collapsed. The rival clans, seeing their leader fall, began to throw down their weapons in surrender. Lord Ethelred approached Ivar, a newfound respect in his eyes. "Well fought, young one. It seems the tales of Viking valor were not exaggerated." Ivar nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of his exertions. "And what of your people, Lord Ethelred? Will you honor your word?" The foreign lord smiled grimly. "We came for a battle, and we have seen one. Your courage has earned our respect. We will help secure your lands against these invaders, and then perhaps we might discuss more peaceful relations between our peoples." As the sun began to set, the battlefield transformed. The rival clans were disarmed and taken prisoner, while the foreign soldiers helped tend to the wounded of both sides. Ivar stood atop the same hill where he had started the day, surveying the aftermath of the battle. Gunnar joined him, placing a hand on the young leader's shoulder. "You did it, lad. You saved our people." Ivar nodded solemnly. "At what cost, Gunnar? Look at the dead, the wounded. This victory tastes of ash." The old warrior squeezed Ivar's shoulder. "That's the burden of leadership, boy. Your father knew it well. The important thing is that our people will live to see another dawn." As night fell, the Vikings began the solemn task of honoring their dead and rebuilding what had been destroyed. Ivar moved among his people, offering words of comfort and encouragement. In the great hall, now serving as a makeshift infirmary, Ivar found Aslaug tending to the wounded. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "My son," she said softly, "you have done what many thought impossible." Ivar knelt beside her, suddenly feeling very young and unsure. "I wish father could have seen it," he whispered. Aslaug cupped his cheek in her hand. "He sees, Ivar. Through your actions, through the strength you've shown, Ragnar lives on." As the long night wore on, Ivar found himself standing at the edge of the fjord, looking out over the dark waters. The weight of leadership, of lives lost and choices made, settled heavily upon his shoulders. But as he stood there, he felt a presence beside him. For just a moment, he could have sworn he saw his father's reflection in the water, nodding in approval. Ivar straightened, a new resolve filling him. The battle was won, but the real challenge, leading his people into a new era, was just beginning. With the memory of Ragnar to guide him, and the strength of his people behind him, Ivar knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the first light of a new day began to break over the horizon, Ivar turned back to the village. The dawn broke over the Viking village, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. The air was thick with tension as the two armies faced each other across the blood-soaked field. On one side stood the battered but determined Vikings led by Ivar, son of Ragnar. Opposite them, the rival clans sneered, confident in their superior numbers. Ivar stood atop a small hill, surveying the battlefield. His father's axe hung heavy in his hand, a reminder of the legacy he now carried. Beside him, Gunnar, the grizzled veteran, spoke in low tones. "They outnumber us 3-1, lad. Many of our warriors are still exhausted from yesterday's skirmish." Ivar nodded grimly. "Numbers aren't everything, Gunnar. We have the strength of desperation and the spirits of our ancestors with us." As the sun climbed higher, the rival clans began to advance. Their war cries filled the air, a cacophony of bloodlust and vengeance. Ivar raised his axe high, his voice carrying across the ranks of his people. "Vikings, today we fight not just for our lives, but for our very way of life. Remember the teachings of Ragnar. We are the children of Odin, and we fear nothing." A roar went up from the Viking ranks, their spirits bolstered by their young leader's words. As the two forces clashed, the air filled with the ring of steel on steel and the cries of the wounded and dying. Ivar fought like a man possessed, his axe a whirlwind of destruction. All around him, Vikings battled with the fury of cornered wolves, each knowing that defeat meant the end of everything they held dear. In the thick of the fighting, Ivar spotted a weakness in the enemy's left flank. "Gunner!" he shouted over the din of battle. "Take a group and hit them from the side. Use the cover of the forest." The old warrior nodded, gathering a band of fighters and disappearing into the trees. Moments later, cries of surprise and pain erupted from the enemy's left as Gunnar's group struck. For a moment it seemed as though the tide of battle was turning in the Vikings' favor, but fate had other plans. As the dust settled on the battlefield, an eerie calm descended upon the clan's encampment. The air was thick with the scent of victory, but also heavy with the weight of loss. Ragnar stood atop a small hill, surveying the aftermath of their hard-fought triumph. His weathered face bore the marks of both relief and exhaustion. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked earth, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. The mysterious old woman, her wizened form hunched against the dying light, approached with slow, deliberate steps. Ragnar's eyes narrowed as he recognized her. "The seer," he murmured, descending the hill to meet her. As he drew near, the old woman's voice croaked out, carried on the wind. "Heed my words, Ragnar Lothbrok. The battle may be won, but the war is far from over." Ragnar's brow furrowed. "Speak plainly, woman. What new doom do you bring?" The seer's milky eyes seemed to look through him. "The threads of fate are tangled, Ragnar. The prophecy is coming to fruition, but not as you might expect. Beware the serpent in your midst." Before Ragnar could question her further, she melted back into the shadows, leaving him with a sense of unease that settled in his gut like a stone. As night fell, Ragnar returned to his tent where his wife, Lagertha, awaited him. Her face was drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and trepidation. "What troubles you, my love?" Ragnar asked, reaching out to caress her cheek. Lagertha took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Ragnar, there is something I must tell you. A secret I have carried for far too long." Ragnar's hand fell away, his expression guarded. "Speak then." "It's about Bjorn," Lagertha began, her voice barely above a whisper. He is not your son." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Ragnar's face remained impassive, but his eyes blazed with a storm of emotions. "Explain," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. Lagertha's words tumbled out in a rush. "Before we were married, I lay with another, a warrior from a neighboring clan. When I discovered I was with child, I knew it could not be yours. But I loved you, Ragnar. I loved you so fiercely that I could not bear to lose you. So I kept this secret, all these years." Ragnar's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. "And you tell me this now, after all we have been through?" "I could not keep it hidden any longer," Lagertha pleaded, "not with the prophecy hanging over us, not with the fate of our people at stake." Ragnar turned away, his shoulders rigid with tension. "Leave me," he growled. As Lagertha slipped out of the tent, tears streaming down her face, a commotion arose from the center of the camp. Ragnar emerged to find a group of his warriors gathered around something glinting in the firelight. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, pushing through the crowd. One of his most trusted warriors, Eric, held up an ornate golden disc, covered in strange markings. "We found it buried beneath the battlefield, my lord. It seems to be of great age and importance." Ragnar took the artifact, turning it over in his hands. As he studied the intricate designs, a chill ran down his spine. This is the Wheel of Fate," he breathed. "An ancient relic spoken of in our oldest legends. It is said to hold the key to our people's destiny." As the clan murmured in awe and speculation, another disturbance broke out at the edge of the camp. A small group of bedraggled warriors stumbled into the firelight, their armor battered and blood-stained. "Survivors," someone whispered, "from Bjorn's forces." The leader of the group, a young man with haunted eyes, fell to his knees before Ragnar. "My lord," he gasped, "we bring grave news. Bjorn, he lives, and he has allied himself with our greatest enemies to the south." A ripple of shock ran through the assembled warriors. Ragnar's face darkened with a mixture of anger and pain. "Tell me everything," he commanded. As the young warrior recounted the tale of Bjorn's betrayal and subsequent alliance with their southern foes, Ragnar's mind raced. The seer's warning, Lagertha's revelation, the discovery of the Wheel of Fate, and now this news of Bjorn's treachery. It was all connected. He was sure of it. With the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders, Ragnar knew he had to make a decision. One that would shape the future of their clan and potentially fulfill the prophecy that had long hung over them. "Hear me, my people," he called out, his voice ringing across the camp. "We stand at a crossroads. Our enemies gather to the south, led by one we once called our own. We have discovered an artifact of great power and significance, and we have been warned of trials yet to come." The clan listened in rapt attention as Ragnar continued. "I propose we do not wait for our enemies to come to us. We will take the fight to them, using the power of the Wheel of Fate to guide our path. We will confront Bjorn and end this threat once and for all." A murmur of dissent rippled through the crowd. One of the elder warriors stepped forward. "But my lord, our forces are depleted. We have just won a great victory, but at great cost. Surely we should take time to recover, to rebuild our strength." Ragnar's eyes flashed. "And give our enemies time to do the same? No. We must strike while the iron is hot. We must seize our destiny with both hands." The debate raged long into the night. Some supported Ragnar's bold plan, while others counseled caution. As the arguments grew heated, the clan began to fracture along lines of loyalty and belief. In the end, Ragnar's will prevailed, but at a cost. Nearly a third of the clan, led by the dissenting elder, chose to remain behind, unwilling to embark on what they saw as a foolhardy quest. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Ragnar stood before his diminished but determined forces. The Wheel of Fate hung from his belt, a constant reminder of the gravity of their mission. "We march south," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "To face our enemies, to confront our past, and to forge our future. The gods watch us, my friends. Let us show them the strength of our people." With a mighty roar, the clan set out, leaving behind the battlefield that had seen their greatest triumph. As they marched towards an uncertain future, the words of the seer echoed in Ragnar's mind. "The prophecy is coming to fruition, but not as you might expect.